Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's episode, where I am joined by the lovely, glamorous Lance Bush. Of the your channel is just called Lance Bush. No, it's Lance Independent, right? That's the channel
Yeah,
name.
Lance
for
Independent.
people who want to check it out. And what we're going to be looking at today is a recent podcast episode, or at least the start of a recent podcast episode that Sam Harris did, where he's covering some of his views of meta-ethics, to sort of track a little bit of that, the stuff that went on beforehand around that. Sam published a book where he made some very sort of contentious claims about meta-ethics. There was a lot of criticism of that book from people who are involved in philosophy, psychology, and various other fields, because Sam takes a very sort of unorthodox view of things and is very confident about the point of view that he takes. And then recently, Alex O'Connor had Sam on his podcast where he challenged him along the lines of some of these criticisms that have been done before. And then I think that this podcast episode that Sam did is kind of a clarification that he was going for of some of his positions in an attempt to kind of like vindicate his views in that format. Do you think that that is roughly accurate, Lance, or is there anything that you'd want to add for context around that?
No, not really. I don't know exactly what prompted him to cover this topic now, but it would make sense that it has some relation to his recent discussion with Alex O'Connor. But I listened to this a couple times, and maybe I just have like Swiss cheese memory, and there's just holes in my brain. But I don't remember him explicitly saying, "Here, now I'm going to address."
Oh yeah,
Alex,
he doesn't mention that himself. I'm just assuming.
Maybe he does later in the video or the podcast, but I don't recall. And if he does, then I'll just be surprised at my, I'll make a Pikachu face at my lack of memory.
No, I don't think I'm fully just making that assumption basically because he appeared on Alex's podcast and talked about this, and he was kind of challenged on this point, I suppose. So I'm guessing that this was an attempt of his to kind of like clarify that, but maybe it's just he independently wanted to sort of, reinstate his views on meta-ethics or something somewhere else. Okay, so I guess then we may as well just kind of jump into it and get started. I'm going to use the YouTube and let me know if there are any issues with the audio or anything. And the other thing I'll do, I'm just going to put my view side by side so I can see us. And I hate Windows so much. There we go. Okay, cool. And just let me know whenever you want me to pause for anything.
Yeah, just make sure the audio is not too loud for me. I have like super sensitive hearing.
Okay, I'm going to play it a bit. You tell me.
Let's see. Oh, it seems fine.
Okay.
Depending on how he talks, it might be a bit low relative to our volume. We'll see.
This is Sam Harris.
Sounds good to me.
Just a note to say that if you're hearing this, you're not currently on our subscriber feed.
I'll leave this in just for if people want to see the full thing. There's the details on how they can do it themselves.
And we'll only be hearing the first part of this conversation. In order to access full episodes of the Making Sense podcast, you'll need to subscribe at samharris.org. There you'll also find our scholarship program, where we offer free accounts to anyone who can't afford one. We don't run ads on the podcast, and therefore it's made possible entirely through the support of our subscribers. So if you enjoy what we're doing here, please consider becoming one. In 2011, I published my third book, The Moral Landscape, which was an edited version of my doctoral dissertation, in which I argued that there are right and wrong answers to questions of human values, and that much of importance depends upon our admit.
Just out of interest, did you ever read that doctoral dissertation? I have not, so I actually don't know. Yeah. What's in that? Okay.
In this, and trying to work out how we can all make moral progress together. The book was widely criticized, both for things I said in it and for things I hadn't said. I did say a few things which needlessly provoked academic philosophers and graduate students. I wrote at one point, by way of explaining why I was dispensing with some of the terminology one might expect to encounter in any discussion of moral truth, that every mention of terms like meta-ethics, deontology, non-cognitivism, anti-realism, and the like directly increases the amount of boredom in the universe. That's still true, of course, but it pissed off a lot of academics.
So just going to pause on that point. Now, I don't know exactly which criticisms he has in mind when he's saying this. for me personally, I think one of the more thorough engagements actually with his book was, I think 2 or 3 videos that Kane Baker and Cole Nasrallah made addressing it. But I know there's also sort of more professional written articles by other philosophers who have sort of like more status in academic philosophy too, responding to Sam's claims in the book. That what I want to highlight in what Sam just said there, particularly pertaining to criticisms of that one point about the amount of technical jargon that's used directly increases the boredom of the universe, is that Sam is going to sort of say this when he kind of doesn't like the conclusions of the technical jargon, but when it's convenient to the point that he's trying to make, to introduce technical jargon because it makes it seem like his views sort of more sophisticated and more powerful in some way because it engages with academic philosophy, he will be more than happy to sort of introduce technical distinctions and use them later, regardless of whether or not they increase the amount of boredom in the universe, right? So I do think he's a little bit inconsistent on just that one point, but I'm sure there's something you wanted to say, Lance, either about that or something else that was said. You're muted, by the way. Muted.
Oh, for sure. So the first thing to say is I can appreciate an attempt at a dry sense of humor about these sorts of things. And I understand that he's, in a certain sense, a little bit maybe trolling or deliberately provoking academic philosophers, which I got to say, I can kind of approve of that in the right context to provoke people. But I do think that if you're going to provoke people, that you kind of got to earn that right by already demonstrating or like signaling you understand what they're talking about, what they're doing, what's going on with it. You know, when there's critics outside of the field of philosophy that are like, philosophy is dead, philosophy is stupid, philosophy is pointless, I often am sympathetic to their conclusions, but I don't think that they have a good sort of inference path to get to where they got to. So they hear fancy jargon, they think it's stupid. They hear conclusions they think are silly, and they don't have any idea how the philosophers arrived at those conclusions, and they think it's stupid. They hear a philosophical position that's actually pretty complicated and interesting and cool, like Dan Dennett's illusionism, and they think it sounds ridiculous because they misunderstand it, and so they dismiss it as stupid. So you have a lot of these sort of external critics that don't understand a field very well and will criticize it in where they reach conclusions similar to the conclusions that I might reach or that you might reach from deeply engaging with a field. Now, Sam Harris has not been totally disengaged from philosophy. He's had some degree of engagement with it. And I don't know what would have prompted him to step back and, end up writing a whole popular book, which apparently is, it was based on his dissertation, which I did not know, that engages with metaethics, but then be super dismissive of metaethics. I don't know exactly what he's read, but in some of his discussions over the years and the way he frames things, I have the impression that he doesn't understand at least some of the distinctions, or if he does understand it, he doesn't show that he understands it. He often seems to want to circumvent them. Now, the issue is that I'm not sure he's shown that he has the knowledge and a level of engagement to warrant that sort of critique from the inside, like from due to a familiarity. And so to me, his dismissiveness of that terminology as boring and pointless and that sort of thing comes off as glib and as a pretty weak excuse for not engaging with that literature. So the humor, I think, could be earned in the right context, but I don't think he's shown that he's earned it. So, but then setting aside the humor, you have to look at what would be motivating him.
Your internet just cut out a second.
Yeah, that just happens. I still haven't resolved the issue. It's going to cut out a couple seconds every once in a while. I can see when it's happening, so I'll just pause when it does. So that sort of tendency for someone to dismiss, like, I think he's masking or excusing his failure to engage with that literature in any substantive way behind this dismissive humor, where the humor kind of makes it less serious than it is. But a couple points I want to make. One is, take out the humor and imagine him just saying, I'm writing a book on metaethics. I have an argument on metaethics, but I'm not going to engage with anything metaethicists say because I find it uninteresting or something. That sounds a little weird when it's not framed in a humorous context. Like, why would you not look at what they're saying? And you could make a comparison to, like, imagine if I said, imagine someone is a climate change denier, and they say, look, all these terms like ocean acidification and meteorology and like, I don't know, cumulonimbus, they all contribute to the boredom in the world. Why would you need to understand or use all that terminology that all those goofy climate scientists are using? I know better than they do. And I know, and then you go on to, produce your theory. Now, that should raise some red flags. It would for climate science, and maybe it should here. Now, what I would grant, I would grant it some asymmetry, which is that I do grant substantially more credibility and expertise to scientists working in a given domain. So climate science, meteorology, physics, whatever it would be, than I do to philosophers. I mean, philosophers can't seem to get their shit together and actually agree on anything. They're always arguing and disagreeing. I think that there's serious problems with the methodology. But again, if you're going to critique the field and say, actually, I don't think we should trust the expertise of the experts on this, I would have hoped Sam would have something to directly say, because take what I do. I think most philosophers are wrong in metaethics. Most of them, not just the realists, the anti-realists do. But the way that I show that is to say, here's what they say, and here's my problem with that. So it's an internal engagement where I show, here's what they say, and here's what my issue is with it. Sam doesn't do that. He just doesn't talk about them or present their work or show why it's wrong. So it's just like a trust me, bro, arguing. Like, he's not engaging with it, and that's really frustrating. Like, in short, if you're going to dismiss an entire field, I think that there's at least some onus on you to make a case for why you're warranted in dismissing that field, and hiding that behind just calling it boring as a joke and saying, I'm just joking about it being boring. Okay, so peel away the jokes. Now, then what are you saying? So if you're joking about it being boring, and that's why you're not really not engaging with it because that it's boring, and we're all supposed to realize that that's silly, then why aren't you engaging with it? What's the actual reason? Because if that's the real reason, that's ridiculous. If that's not the real reason, then what is the real reason? We're just not told. So I really don't like that rhetorical move.
Yeah, and I do think that it's not that being disparaging of philosophy is off limits or something in general. I think it's just that you have to be able to sort of like provide good reasons for your rejection. That's going to involve elaborating a little bit on metaphilosophy and your reasons for doing so and things like that. And yeah, I don't think that Sam's doing that. And I think that then his kind of dismissal on the basis, you could kind of overlook this and say, look, it's not that much of a big deal. But I think his dismissal of the standard field because it increases the amount of boredom is going to do like a whole lot of work in kind of justifying why now we require Sam's completely alternative theory and worldview, to be constructed and presented in this way. And so it does actually do a hell of a lot of work in kind of establishing the necessity of Sam's point of view. And I think that there's almost, this kind of intellectual hubris there as well, because, Sam's view is sort of has a lot of tensions to it, and it overlooks a lot of basic things that if he were to simply engage with others' work in, a less hubristic way, he might not overlook some of these problems because people have, talked about them before, and he's kind of reinventing the wheel in a lot of ways, but just perhaps in a little bit of a less rigorous way, or a way, a way with less time spent and less dialogue and criticism spent on the views to refine them. So I do think there's quite a lot going on in just that small comment that he's making at the start that's like very indicative of like intellectual vices in Sam's that make up a part of Sam's epistemology, like motivations for his project. I think it gives insights into those, but also like justification for why you even require, there's almost like metaphilosophical assumptions that you require this alternative new theory because all the other ones are wrong because they're boring or something like that. Right. So yeah.
Worse, many people couldn't get past the book's subtitle, How Science Can Determine Human Values, because they have a far narrower conception of science than I do. Many people, including many scientists, seem pretty confused about the boundaries between science and other modes of thought, as I'll discuss here. Consider the concept of objectivity, which most people assume is central to science. It is central, but only...
So whenever I hear, claims like that, the concept of objectivity, which most people assume is central to science, my Lance Bush alarm goes off, because I honestly personally don't know what most people consider to be central to science, and science in general, when it's so many different disciplines that mean so many different things to many people. I mean, I can understand what he might be getting at, which is the sense that maybe the findings of science are better verified than other types of claims, or so, and maybe I lean in the direction of, but the idea that most people share some collective idea of objectivity and philosophy of science or something when it comes to that, I really don't know about.
Well, yeah, so there's another issue, and he does address this to his credit, which I think is good, which is that that notion of objectivity is very ambiguous. And there's a difference between, at least two senses of objectivity, which is, when we're approaching science, we should approach it in a way where we attempt to be as neutral as possible. We attempt to mitigate motivated reasoning. We attempt to look at things from an unbiased perspective and minimize, basically baking our desires into our conclusions. That type of objectivity is absolutely one of the virtues and hallmarks of a good approach to science. On the other hand, I don't think it's baked into science that we presuppose some sort of particular ontology. That, I'm not even a scientific realist. I don't presume that our scientific models are telling us what reality is really like at its foundations. I just pulled up the 2020 Phil paper survey, and you have about 72% of philosophers are endorse scientific realism. You have about 15% don't, and then about 14% that choose others. So you have nearly a third that do not endorse scientific realism among philosophers. Now, I would guess that scientific realism is more popular among scientists themselves, but I don't take it to be some sort of, there's no univocal endorsement of an ontological type of objectivity to science. And in fact, I think that the case for that is not that strong. I don't endorse it. And I am very much like a radical empiricist. So I'm not at all one of those armchair a prioristic philosophers that thinks that there's all these non-natural facts and all this stuff that falls outside the scope of science. I'm all in on science being the best way, and I do have a broad conception of science, but I don't take what science delivers to us to be some sort of special ontology. So he will disambiguate that, but I do want to flag that this ambiguity can, at this point in the discussion, could mislead people about science.
And I suppose here as well, I'm not even sure that someone assenting to claims like science provides us with objective truths or objective facts or something, someone who agrees to claims of that sort of form, I'm not sure that that means that they therefore, agree to some kind of like realist interpretation of philosophy of science or something like that. Like, I think you can render agreeing with those claims sort of consistent with other interpretations of philosophy of science, including anti-realist claims, anti-realist views, sorry, not claims, pragmatist views, all sorts of other views. So it's not clear to me why getting clear about objectivity understood not in the sense of reducing biases, but objectivity in the sense of being about a stance independent world or something like that corresponds to thoughts. It's not clear to me why that would be useful, because I just don't think it has to feature in people's thought in any kind of way for them to be able to do first order science, right? Like, you don't really have to have some sort of like meta scientific view of what it really is that you're doing to be able to engage in it. But
it's funny because that's usually the point I'm always making, and I didn't make it and you did. But there is this presumption that Sam Harris is actually, in some sense, ironically sharing with philosophers, which is this presumption that one's judgments, actions, one sort of concrete first order output in terms of behavior, judgments, actions, decisions, deliberation, that is underwritten by these implicit philosophical commitments. And I think that's just not true. And where it is true, I think that's an empirical question, and one would need to provide empirical evidence that it is true. Even if someone were to say, I'm a scientific realist, that doesn't mean that sort of verbalized commitment is playing any functional role in their actual like day-to-day judgments and decisions. I think a lot of metaphysics, because I'm a pragmatist and I think a lot of metaphysics is a bunch of superfluous nonsense. I I think that one of the things that you would observe is that in practice, metaphysics is a bunch of superfluous nonsense, and that it almost never plays any substantive functional role in how people actually do anything or make any decisions. And so I think people could be pretty much meta theory free and they could do science quite well. That doesn't mean they don't have principles and various sorts of foundational guidelines and principles and standards that are motivating what they do. But what they don't typically need is some sort of commitment, some deep metaphysical commitment. But I'm not even sure what he means by objectivity here. So,
in one sense of the term. As the philosopher John Searle once pointed out, we should distinguish between epistemological and ontological senses of objectivity. Of course, terms like epistemological and ontological also increase the amount of boredom in the universe, but I'm afraid they're indispensable.
And that's what I'm talking about, but I'm afraid they're indispensable. Oh, so now that it's convenient for my case, when I say so as the sort of smartest guy in the room, it's okay for us to introduce these boring terms, but when I don't like them, they're just boring and I'm not going to engage with them, and we don't need them. And I think that is sort of inconsistent of Sam.
Epistemology relates to the foundation of knowledge. How do we know what is true? In what sense can a statement be true? Ontology relates to questions about what exists. For instance, is there only one type of stuff in the universe? Are there only physical things? Or are there really existent things which are not physical? For instance, do numbers exist beyond their physical representations? And if so, how? Science is fully committed to epistemological objectivity, that is, to analyzing evidence and argument without subjective bias. But it is in no sense committed to ontological objectivity. It isn't limited to studying objects, that is, purely physical things and processes. We can study human subjectivity, the mind as experienced from the first-person point of view.
Hold on. Can you take that back a few seconds? I want to listen to that again.
It isn't limited to studying objects, that is, purely physical things and processes, without subjective bias. But it is in no sense committed to ontological objectivity. It isn't limited to studying objects, that is, purely physical things and processes.
Does he think ontological objectivity means you're limited to studying objects or physical things?
I think so. From the description he's given there, that would seem to be
that's not what objectivity is in the ontological sense.
In the ontological sense,
because one could have a priori access to there being abstract properties or something that are not physical, and yet they're objective in the sense of being like stance independently true, like they're real in a sense that's not made true by our attitudes or preferences.
I think, though, I don't know that that's necessarily a sort of reductio of Sam's position, because I think Sam could just say, so like that's why mathematics is considered a science, or that's why because the a priori grasping of these mathematical objects is what makes it a science or something. I don't know, but like I'm saying, he could make it consistent there. I think he'd maybe just bite the bullet and say, like, when people grasp when people study objects and the relations between them in this kind of way, they're doing, but he's saying science isn't just limited to that as well, I guess, because he's going to say, and again, this is sort of, for me, it's not clear how this actually makes sense for a naturalist to say, but he's going to say, that things like thoughts are not like objects that exist. They're subject, and there's a sense in which maybe that's true epistemically, but I think if you're a reductive naturalist or something like that, you're going to think, well, actually, there is a relation between all of these things in physical states too. So it's not like so. I think you can unpack what he's saying. I think what he's saying here isn't going to make sense on the whole with like the way he wants to view the world a bit later on.
It just, I had the impression, I almost want to just listen to this from where he started with this.
Yeah, sure.
Oh, can we do
I can
that?
get it.
It sounds to me like he's misunderstanding what objectivity is in the ontological sense, but I want to be sure. So I guess I'll just listen.
Questions about what exists. For instance, is there only one type of stuff in the universe? Are there only physical things? Or are there really existent things which are not physical? For instance, do numbers exist beyond their physical representations? And if so, how? Science is fully committed to epistemological objectivity, that is, to analyzing evidence and argument without subjective bias. But it is in no sense committed to ontological objectivity. It isn't limited to studying objects, that is purely physical things and processes.
Yep,
We can study
objects, purely physical things. No, that's just a mistake. It's a misunderstanding what ontological objectivity is. So
It
he
is so
seems to be-
inconsistent with what he said, because he did just say before that
Right.
the ontology part was about, do numbers exist beyond their physical instantiations? Yeah,
So he
I
first
think
characterizes ontological objectivity appropriately as this view that there are facts about the underlying nature, like how many types of things exist and the nature of those things, independent of our attitudes or preferences. And that's fine. I don't even know if he added that latter portion, although he should have. Then he goes on to say that it's only committed to epistemological objectivity, not ontological objectivity, because it studies more than just objects or physical things. So he appears to have immediately.
I see. The argument doesn't work there. Yeah. I get what you're
So it
saying.
looks like he just contradicted his own definition that he gave.
You're saying so ontological objectivity encompasses physical and non-physical things.
Yes.
Science cannot just be the study of ontological objectivity because it only studies physical things, right?
But that's not what he was saying. He was saying,
but sorry, because it studies both physical and non-physical, because it studies more than
right. So it's not committed to ontological objectivity because it's not stuck only studying the physical. But that contradicts his own definition, which he just gave a few seconds beforehand. So, okay, just to walk through just how kind of absurd this is. He says ontological objectivity has to do with like what exists, how many things there are. Are there things that are non-physical but they exist? That's what but and they exist apart from us. They're not made true by us. Then he immediately says, so science can't be committed to that because it doesn't only deal with physical things. What? So, but you could still be an ontological objectivist about non-physical things. He just said that, and that is the standard way that someone would construe that characterization. What on earth just happened here? Like, it's a straightforward contradiction. I mean, didn't you have anybody vet this or review this?
Yeah, and so the thing is, I think I kind of agree with his conclusion here, but obviously the reasoning or the justification he's offering is wrong, right?
Well, it's not that he's saying because the only things that do exist are physical things.
Oh yeah, I agree. That's what I'm saying. No, I'm saying his conclusion that science is committed to epistemological objectivity, or just keeping your biases down, but isn't committed to ontological objectivity.
Right.
I think I agree with the conclusion, but
I agree with the conclusion too.
But his offering of reasons for that conclusion, as if he's kind of like, just offered some kind of knockdown argument, that bit is obviously wrong.
Right. So he arrives at what I think is the right conclusion. Science is committed to epistemological objectivity, but not ontological objectivity. But that isn't because science studies non-physical things. It's because I think there's background reasons. Like, I'm a pragmatist.
Well, it'd be difficult to give an argument for, I think, but it's going to be something like because the sort of like values of science are about trying to keep things that vary individually out of the equation, and the success of your kind of like theories and model construction and stuff, right? Like,
I mean, it would be a whole discussion to get into why I wouldn't be an objectivist, like an ontological objectivist. I don't really like that terminology.
But it's not what I'm saying is the reason why science is more committed to sort of like the reduction of individual bias, but not committed to some particular sort of like stance on metaphysical objectivity, right? Is quite actually a complicated. There's not just some like simple deductive argument of like, because science doesn't only study physical things, therefore.
Well, I see science as this practice that we look back on retrospectively, and we understand it in a somewhat sociological and historical terms. Like, science is what scientists do, and I understand it more in terms of its methods and its values than in terms of its metaphysical presuppositions. And so understanding it in terms of its commitment to things like objectivity is conveyed through like the practice of peer review and people mutually reviewing one another's work and those sorts of things. Whereas scientists don't need to take stances on the metaphysical presuppositions behind their theories in order for those theories to work and do the things that they need to do. So like, as a matter of description, I also think that it doesn't come away. Like, you could also say, as a matter of description, scientists take themselves to be studying real things, and they are making metaphysical claims or assumptions, but I don't think that those are functionally necessary to do science. Whereas I think that minimizing bias is functionally necessary to do science, or at least to do science effectively.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
Human subjectivity, the mind as experienced from the first person point of view, objectively, that is, without bias and other sources of cognitive error. And as I've argued elsewhere, meditation is a crucial tool for doing this. It is simply
and this is such a I think a problematic part of Sam's reasoning as well, the way that he sort of uncritically accepts the givenness of his interpretation of meditative experience as a metaphysical theory. So Sam, his kind of like personal interest and obsession with meditation, he claims that part of the reason that it's so important is because it provides sort of these insights into metaphysical claims such as the nature of the self, or that there is no self, for example. And he sort of seems to think that he can just read these interpretations directly off of some of the sorts of experiences that he's having, regardless of the fact that there are multiple competing metaphysical explanations that can give you the experience, and you can compare and contrast those explanations for which one's best. And I think that that's that isn't what I think any good scientist would be doing. I don't think the methodology of just sort of reading off your seemings, as Sam seems to be doing, is what I would call good science. I'd hope a psychologist who was investigating subjective attitudes in meditation or something would do something a bit more cautious than just, naively read people's first interpretations of those experiences as metaphysical fact or something.
Yeah, I completely agree. I also want to draw attention to the irony here, which is that he's fairly dismissive of the way analytic philosophers approach this issue. And yet, a sort of immediate reflexive reliance on believing your introspections have the, like, you could just look at your phenomenology and know what's real. That's exactly what I find problematic about what philosophers do. That's exactly what I take to be the poor methodology of philosophers, and why I take an empiricist orientation towards philosophy in the first place. And so Sam is simultaneously both dismissive of philosophers and employing the worst methodological vices of philosophy.
Fact that human beings can become much better observers of their direct experience, and becoming better at this actually makes a wider range of experience possible. Morality is subjective in the ontological sense, right? It's not found out there among the atoms. It rests on the reality of consciousness and the experiences of conscious beings.
Go.
Oh, sorry.
You go ahead. Don't worry. Yeah.
Oh, if it's subjective in the ontological sense, we're done here. He's an anti-realist.
That what I was going to say as well is that there's work that needs to be done to establish that subjectivity in the epistemic sense means subjectivity in some metaphysical sense, where you couldn't, for example, through understanding facts about brains and nervous systems and things like that, come to an understanding of the types of subjective states that some being was in. So even in Sam's claims here, there's sort of these what I would call naive assumptions that people tend to make quite early on in philosophy, say like a distinction between subjectivity and objectivity, that then people very just uncritically adopt, like, yeah, that just seems quite obvious to me. But I think that actually these notions of the objective world out there and the subjective world in here, as it were, are actually very kind of complicated and intricate, and there are more kind of sophisticated views that relate the kind of private epistemic access that we seem to have to the world, to our practice and action in the world, that just need to be more cautiously pried apart. And especially when you want to construct an overall sort of theory of reality that's consistent and not in tension with one another. Because I think that the way that Sam is kind of loosely talking about subjectivity and objectivity here is going to rule out certain sort of naturalist or physicalist even views of mind that I think he himself would want to hold to. And so I think that actually there's a tension in his overall worldview from the way that he talks about subjectivity and objectivity here. Because as far as I know, Sam isn't like an idealist or like a qualia private essentialist or something, you know, like a dualist of some description. I think that Sam is someone who, you know, says that neuroscience is what explains consciousness and will explain it and so forth. So
He's also made remarks that like consciousness is the one thing we could be sure exists. And so he's made some remarks that hint at a dissatisfaction with illusionist counts of consciousness, but I need to go back and review precisely what he says about those. So that would make me guess, because I would imagine that he's going to reject non-naturalist views and anti-physicalist views. But if he's also unsatisfied with something like Dennett's views, then it would make it seem like he would be probably camped somewhere in like non-reductive physicalism.
Well, but when he's making these claims, you know, that the subjective is inaccessible, you know, through objective study and stuff, that's definitely got some implications for his, I mean, supposing he renders it all into a sort of overarching theory of the world, and they're not just kind of like squared away bits that he kind of thinks about on a one-off.
To say that morality is subjective is not to say that it isn't real. We can make truth claims about it. That is, we can be epistemologically objective about it. I hope that distinction is clear. To say that science is committed to epistemic objectivity is to say that science depends on certain epistemic values, values like coherence and simplicity and elegance and predictive power. If I told you that I had an extremely important scientific theory that was self-contradictory and needlessly complex and could not account for past data and could make no predictions whatsoever, you would understand that I must be joking or otherwise speaking nonsense. We cannot separate statements of scientific fact from the underlying epistemic values of science. These values are axiomatic, which is to say that science does not discover them or even attempt to justify them. It just presupposes their validity. If you suspect that I have just called the traditional distinction between facts and values into question, you would be right. And this is a point to which I will return. For those unfamiliar with the moral landscape, here is my argument in brief. Morality and values depend upon the existence of conscious minds, and specifically on the fact that such minds can experience various forms of well-being and suffering in this universe. Conscious minds and their...
So just to sort of pause at this point, I think both Lance and I would agree that you know, values only make sense dependent upon minds, right? Though obviously that's not, it's important to clarify that that's not what everyone says. Some people have very different points of view on this, but I think Lance and I both struggle to make sense of the sort of talk of values for no one from no one's point of view sort of thing, right? I think the part of Sam's view that then becomes, to me, both poorly motivated but also theoretically quite poor, as in it can't account for the data, which is all of our morality discourse, and it introduces tensions in his view, is going to be this attempt to reduce value to well-being, right? To reduce all moral sentences, all moral discourse, and all experiences of value to simply just well-being or lack of well-being. And I think that I think that there are issues for this. I also think that the requirement to do that is poorly motivated. But don't know if there's anything you want to say, Lance.
No, I'm sorry to have to ask again, but can we start that from the beginning?
Yeah, no worries. Don't worry.
Values of science. These values are axiomatic, which is to say that science does not discover them or even attempt to justify them. It just presupposes their validity. If you suspect that I have just called the traditional distinction between facts and values into question, you would be right. And this is a point to which I will return. For those unfamiliar with the moral landscape, here is my argument in brief. Morality and values depend upon the existence of conscious minds, and specifically on the fact that such minds can experience very...
So I've always had an issue with him saying that like morality depends on conscious minds, because that to me is too underspecified. Depends in what way? Like he doesn't explain the dependency relation. So one thing you could say is something like this. In order for someone to experience positive or negative mental states, they need to be conscious. They need to have a mind. In order for people to care about things, they need to have a mind. And so things like caring and experiencing joy and sadness, all of those are mind dependent in a certain sort of way. They are states of affairs that necessarily require certain types of mental states in order to occur. Like they just are constituted by or require those mental states. That is one type of mind dependence. But the sense in the academic literature in which we talk about whether or not there are objective or stance independent moral facts, that's not what that's about. So like, it would be really weird to say utilitarianism is a type of moral anti-realism because it's all about happiness and suffering, and those states depend on mind. So it's mind dependent. So boom, subjectivism. That's totally wrong. The dispute in the academic literature is about whether or not the moral facts are made true by our attitudes. Like it is our attitudes that are serving as the truth makers. So if I desire that something is true, then it literally is the case that it's true vis-a-vis my desire. Or alternatively, that's not what the facts are like. So when he's talking about mind, like morality depending on minds, which type of dependency relation is he talking about? Is it some sort of like ontological dependency, like you need X to exist in order for this to take place or occur? Or is it some sort of like, I don't know, like, I don't know the term for it, like propositional dependent, like you need this, like this thing is serving as the truth maker for that thing. So you need it in order to make that thing true. That's just a different distinction. And he's not clear on whether he means one of those, both of those, some third alternative so he just says depends, and he doesn't say. When he does talk about this dependency, it seems wobbly. Like I'm not sure what exactly the dependency relation is. And the thing is, philosophers write whole papers on these sorts of things. Like they write on like the grounding of objectivity and this sort of thing. And so there is a relevant literature on this that he could draw on and either reference that literature, and maybe its terminology is too arcane and weird, and he could, by engaging with it, have a really clear and straightforward way of saying I could mean A, B, or C, and I mean A. That's what I mean. But since he doesn't engage with that literature, it may be that he's not aware of the under-specificity of just saying depends. That like depends in what way. So that is already a problem from the outset. There's under-specificity and ambiguity, and it's like omnipresent in the things that he says about these sorts of topics. And one of the things that's so frustrating with the people that are fans of his work is that he'll use like fancy terms and clever turns of phrase and funny and thoughtful analogies that, like, he mentions like a aluminum flavored ice cream. Maybe someone would object and say it's aluminium, but all of that, I think, gives the impression that he's speaking clearly about these issues. Now, he's saying things that sound clear, but obscure it's like the tip of an iceberg, of a very deep iceberg of conceptual and terminological distinctions that are carved out in the academic literature, which he doesn't engage with and just says it's all boring. And so that I just find that super duper frustrating.
Ooh, I didn't unmute myself. I do think that there's a way of interpreting what he's saying about dependence there, which is a view that you and I are both sympathetic to when it comes to value. And I think that, I mean, I'm sure there's more that you'll say, but for me, the really contentious thing here is then just the attempt to reduce everything to well-being, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, what's the need to do that? Why make that move? Why does there have to be some underlying one thing? Why is it not good enough for morality to encompass, a whole bunch of or values and things, to just encompass a whole bunch of different emotions, social phenomena, relations between people, bits of language and things like that? Why does it have to just be reduced to well-being? Like, the essence of it is this one thing that I found now. But
I think that's the biggest issue with his account, which is that he just doesn't have a good argument or rationale for why it should all be reducible to well-being. The other thing I want to flag, though, is that he starts out by saying my argument is, and
doesn't
does that, and then he either doesn't present an argument, he presents like a chain of assertions, and it's unclear what the or he'll
relationship is between them.
Yeah, or he'll make this convoluted inferential path, like his original tweet that is like famous, but with the person touching the hot stove. I've looked over that a few times. The inferential path, if there is one, from some set of clear premises to a valid argument for a conclusion, is so convoluted.
Well, did you watch the Cain B? Did you watch the Cain B. Colin Nasrallah video?
I did, but that was like 2-3 years ago now, right? Maybe
it
longer.
Was. Yeah, I think longer. But I think the way that they quite clearly, stated the problem there, it's just simply that you can't, in a deductive argument, You can't get something in the conclusion that isn't in the premises, So Sam's only making that all of the premises are of the form is, right? And you just cannot get an ought premise out of them, because if you have some hidden premise, some suppressed premise of, if these is claims obtain, then you get an ought claim or something. If there's a hidden premise like that, then you'll get your ought claim, right, by combining it. But if there is no set proposition that has an ought statement in it, you're just not going to get it using deductive logic in that way. Yeah.
As understood as a basic feature of the way that logic works, that it's conservative and you can't get things out of the conclusion that aren't somewhere in the premises. The is-ought gap is as solid as any gap could be. I think, doesn't Kane B he jokingly refers to like the hedgehog gap? Like you can't have an argument with conclusions about hedgehogs where there's no hedgehogs in the premises.
I don't remember that, but yeah.
Like it's something like that. But it works for literally anything. You can't have an argument you can't have premises about a conclusion about oranges if you don't have them in the premises. That's just, this is just how logic works.
I think here, though, Sam has confused people, like a lot of people's understanding of morality so much that people think that there is like an is-ought problem, in the sense of, it's like we know that one of these reduces to the other and just no one's figured out quite how yet or something, like we know that these discourses must reduce in some way, but no one's figured out the bridging gap between them. And I don't think that is the way that people think about them. It's just that they're different type of claims, different types of propositions or sentences, and when you deductively have premises constituting only of one, you don't get conclusions of the other type. It's not like a problem to be solved or something. It's just a description of the way, an observation almost. And this whole thinking of it and framing of it as like there's this problem no one could solve until Sam came along, with his theory and finally solved it, is just completely mistaken view of what's going on here.
Values depend upon the existence of conscious minds, and specifically on the fact that such minds can experience various forms of well-being and suffering in this universe. Conscious minds and their states are natural phenomena, of course, fully constrained by the laws of nature, whatever those turn out to be. Therefore, there must be right and wrong answers to questions of morality and values that potentially
fully constrained by the laws of nature, whatever those turn out to be, up to and including panpsychism, idealism. Like that's such a cop out of the. But yeah.
Well, yeah. He also says like, therefore, there must be right answers. I would have to like write this down to actually look at whether that conclusion seems to follow. But I'm happy to grant the benefit of the doubt that it's like it's an enthemy, and there's a couple premises he could add where this would be a valid argument. So I think that's fine. People don't have to lay out literally every premise. So you could always like throw in a conditional, like if the moral facts are about this, and then if we can know about the moral, if we can know about this, then we can know about the moral facts. So you could throw in a couple conditionals you didn't make explicit. So that's probably fine.
I don't disagree with your point that people don't have to consistently be making valid deductive arguments or something. However, I do think that in the case of what Sam's talking about, the potentially hidden or suppressed premises in the inferential chain are going to be just the contentious ones that are like the basis of his thesis about reducing the ought claims to is claims, right? And so I think that that's going to be the problem with what he's doing here, is that he can kind of appeal to some less contentious like, oh, people don't like putting their hands on hot stoves and stuff, but he's not making it as clear where he's reducing all like statements of the form, you ought to do that, down to, some kind of well-being state or something.
The other point to make though is, I'm trying to be charitable here, and thinking that there might be suppressed premises here, and I'm saying that's typically in most contexts fine. This is not a context where I think that's a wise move. If your argument is one where a lot of people misunderstand your argument, well, you have some responsibility if you're not presenting a clear, valid argument that arrives at your conclusion because you're suppressing premises. Like if the problem is that he's a perfectly valid argument for his conclusion and he's not telling us all the premises, why doesn't he just give us a valid argument? Like sit down, do the work. This is someone, who has an extraordinary network, who is far more privileged in his access to experts. He could probably get 100 logicians calling him, maybe not 100, 20, 10, 5, 3,
he could get some amount, a non-trivial amount of expert logicians to help him put together a valid argument. He could even give his argument to them all, and ask them all to produce a valid argument, and then like he could extrapolate from that. Like there's all sorts of things he could do.
There's even Chat GPT now.
Even that. So if you are going around making an argument, people aren't clear on the argument, and you're saying, you're all unclear. Why put that all on everybody else? Like, I'm not clear on what he's saying, and I don't think I'm a completely idiotic moron with no training or education on the topic. I'm not going to say I'm by no means anywhere close to experts at logic, but again, he has access to an extraordinary pool of them, and they could just say, look, let's work this into a completely valid and like straightforward, clear argument where we're consistent with the terminology, and we don't have too many buried premises. Boom, here it is. He could present that and then say, now deal with this. William Lane Craig does this. He puts out his moral argument. Boom, there's your moral argument. So there's a reason why people with a background in philosophy will give you a formal argument. Now, I'm often critical of formal arguments. I think that they often compress down and leave out important background and contextual information, and they have their problems. But this is exactly the kind of case where a structured, valid argument this is the context where you'd want to have that, and he doesn't have that. And I think that's a problem.
Of course, fully constrained by the laws of nature, whatever those turn out to be. Therefore, there must be right and wrong answers to questions of morality and value.
Hang on. So there are mind is a product of nature, therefore there must be right and wrong answers to questions of morality.
Well, moral facts are facts about changes in the mind. The mind is subject to scientific inquiry, and so we can study the moral facts by studying the mind, something like that.
Yeah, I guess there is a way of making sense of what he's saying there. I think the reason that it wouldn't work is if, for example, moral discourse was something to do with social convention and there were no natural laws that determine which particular social convention a group of human beings, prefer.
Well, that's something I would think, because I do think morality is socially constructed. So this is going to be an issue. Which is
what I'm saying is consistent with. So Sam's kind of claim that follows from accepting naturalism, that there's nothing, there's nothing about the mind over and above the natural or physical. It doesn't follow just from that. You can make it follow by combining it with these other claims, but those other claims are gonna potentially lead you to a sort of like that might be less good accounts of moral discourse in general, right?
Sure, but they could technically be studied by like anthropology and sociology and psychology, and so you would still be able to, like, even under those circumstances, it would fall within the ambit of science and empiricism.
Sort of. I think there's a thesis here, though, about the unity of science that I don't buy into. So, for example, whilst I think that all of these sciences are, just as legitimate as one another, I mean, obviously there's different kind of publication issues and things in different sciences. The point is that I don't think that there's theoretical reduction between them necessarily. So it's not that I wouldn't make the assumption as a naturalist that if I knew everything about microphysical states at the start of the universe, I could somehow derive, what the correct moral facts would be for people living in the Amazon in 1000 AD or something. Mm-hmm. I don't think that the sort of social discourses that people construct, like those of morality, can be derived from microphysical discourses about the physical states in the world like that. That's so I think if you buy into this really strong unity of science thesis, like maybe you can get that working, but I wouldn't myself.
Yeah, historically I've been sympathetic to that view, but it's under revision now for me, so I don't know what to make. I would be just agnostic on that.
Views that potentially fall within the purview of science. On this view, some people and cultures will be right to a greater or lesser degree, and some will be wrong with respect to what they deem important in life. Many people worry that any aspect of human subjectivity or culture could fit in the space I just provided, After all, a preference for chocolate over vanilla ice cream is a natural phenomenon, as is a preference for the comic Bill Burr over Bob Hope. Are we to imagine that there are universal truths about ice cream and comedy that admit of scientific analysis? Well, in a certain sense, yes. Science could, in principle, account for why some of us prefer chocolate to vanilla, or why no one's favorite flavor of ice cream is aluminum. Comedy must also be susceptible to this kind of study. There will be a fair amount of cultural and generational variation in what counts as funny, but there are basic principles of comedy, like the violation of expectations, the breaking of taboos, etc., that could be universal.
Could be versus actually are, very different.
Amusement to the point of laughter is a specific state of the human nervous system that can be scientifically studied. Why do some people laugh more readily than others? What exactly happens when we, quote, get a joke? They're ultimately questions about the human mind and brain. There will be scientific facts to be known here.
I also think that if you're appealing to these as examples where something that appears to be subjective and outside of the purview of science is actually then explained by rigorous objective scientific facts, that you don't want your examples that you appeal to be hypotheticals where they hypothetically could in principle be explained by an objective science, and therefore use those as inferential justification for why the case that you're looking at of something that appears to be subjective can be explained by an objective science, right? You'd instead want to appeal to actual cases where this is worked out. So I don't think that this is going to be a very good argument.
And any differences in taste among human beings must be attributable to other facts that fall within the purview of science. If we were ever to arrive at a complete understanding of the human mind, we would understand human preferences of all kinds, and we might even be able to change them. However, epistemic and ethical values appear to reach deeper than mere matters of taste, beyond how people...
So what Sam's just said there, I think, is in conflict with what he said earlier about about the distinction between subjective and objective, because based off of what he's just said there, all subjective states can be understood by, understanding objective physical states. And there's a reduction between them, which is fine. But given, as Sam said earlier as well, one of the theoretical virtues that he cares about is overall consistency of worldview. That should be a concern for him.
People happen to think and behave, to questions of how they should think and behave. And it is this notion of should that introduces a fair amount of confusion into any conversation about moral truth. I should note in passing, however, that I don't think the distinction between ethics and something like taste is as clear or as categorical as we might think. For instance, if a preference for chocolate ice cream allowed for the most rewarding experience a human being could have, while a preference for vanilla did not, we would deem it morally important to help people overcome any defect in their...
That is speculation, right? What would human societies actually do if that were the case? I don't know if that's right, and I don't think that relying upon speculation about a weird case like that should be a key inferential link in justifying Sam's moral theory here.
Yeah, I would say, though, I'm pretty sympathetic to saying that there's no clear boundary between moral and non-moral issues, but I don't think that's going to help Sam very much in the long run. And that's largely because the reason why I don't think there's a clear boundary between moral and non-moral issues is because my own view of morality, and there is published work on this. Edward Mashery and Stephen Stitch both have really good papers in a recent volume called The Atlas of Moral Psychology. Stephen Stitch argues that attempts to provide a unified account of the sort of the metanormative features that distinguish moral norms from non-moral norms have systematically failed both among philosophers and psychologists for a variety of reasons. I would recommend checking out the paper. It's called The Moral Domain, where he gives a sort of brief overview, both of how psychologists have attempted to say, here's what distinguishes moral norms from non-moral norms. That really hasn't panned out. And also that philosophical attempts to say, here's what distinguishes moral norms from non-moral norms have failed. Mashery has a paper that's called something like Morality, a Historical Invention, something like that. I don't remember if it's a question mark or not, or maybe it just says Morality, a Historical Invention. And Mashery's view is very roughly that this notion of this distinct normative domain of morality is something that has emerged in particular cultures. It's not a natural kind. It doesn't represent, it's not like if we ran into extraterrestrials, they would have a shared concept of morality. They would have some other
potentially important regulatory normative domain that governs their social behavior and actions, but it wouldn't be conceptually identical or necessarily that closely overlapping to our own. There's other work. Tally Wheatley and Walter Sinnott Armstrong have a couple papers on the disunity of the moral domain, and they sort of systematically evaluated TIPS. In other words, I think that distinction breaks down, but it breaks down in a way that reveals that the notion of a distinctively moral domain is itself probably an artifact of particular cultures. And so this quest for sciencing up one's study of morality would need to be at the very least qualified by an appreciation for the challenges posed by there not being necessarily these like natural kind normative domain distinctions that we might want to make. And Sam Harris, in some respects, might be right here to draw this to make this point about food. Anything could, in principle, be moralized, and that's one of the problems with the moral domain, that it doesn't seem that it could be distinguished in terms of its content. In other words, the things we moralize, you could moralize anything in principle, without it being too much of a stretch, as long as you were culturally familiar with and inculcated in that society. Where in our society, we moralize the clothing you wear or the foods you eat. Totally possible. But I think that does raise questions that you would want to engage with meta-ethics and empirical moral psychology to really get a handle on some of the potential philosophical and practical problems that would arise from that issue, that this particular domain breaks down, because it's a bit weird to say that morality is about well-being if there isn't even a clear and distinct moral domain in the first place. What is it that's about well-being? So I think Sam, along with many philosophers, is kind of overlooking some challenges in saying that there's a moral domain. Personally, I suspect that this is because most of the people working on this and publishing on this in English are from weird cultures, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic cultures. You could see Joe Henrich and colleagues work on that. So I think that they are looking at things from a narrow, parochial, culturally biased lens through which they see the world, and that prompts them to think that everything can be sort of ratcheted into seemingly familiar distinctions. But I think that's largely a mirage of the way that we use language, and in particular in this case, largely a mirage of both the residual cultural influences of Christianity and Western philosophy, coupled with a distinctively narrow conception of philosophy that, again, ironic given Sam's dismissal of academic metaethics, a distinctively, like, it's even extra parochial because it's so focused on Western society and Anglophone philosophical terms, thinking, and categories that's largely confined to the English language. And I think that these linguistic and conceptual issues just pop up everywhere.
Yeah, so I don't disagree with that, and I certainly don't disagree with what you said about the idea that there is a clear distinction between, this sort of like normative realm and the rest of discourse breaks down. The point I was trying to highlight is that Sam alleges to be offering an argument in favor of his conclusion, right? His conclusion being that the normative reduces to well-being. And then the reason that he gives in favor of that is this thought experiment whereby, ice cream, the taste of some particular chocolate or ice cream or whatever gives people the most well-being possible. And then he says, and in that case, we would think that was good, or we should do that or something. Therefore, my reduction is correct. But the only reason to think that in that hypothetical, we would think that is good, or we should do that, is going to be if you already accept the conclusion, because that's the only way that it becomes an entailment of the other. So I'm saying that using this hypothetical as a reason in favor of his conclusion, I think, is mistaken, because like what you imagine in that hypothetical world is going to basically be entirely the result of whether or not you accept Sam's sort of theory in the first place, right?
So that's going to be a problem. But there's another problem here, which is that if you're trying to show, hey, morality is reducible to well-being, if you provide examples of instances in which we would moralize something when it's concerned with well-being, then you're finding evidence consistent with your hypothesis. But that's not a good way to test your hypothesis. What you'd want to do is look if for any instances that might be inconsistent with your hypothesis. So that might be something like a moral judgment that isn't reducible to considerations about well-being. So, it'd be very silly if I said, hey, look, my theory is that all mammals are dogs. Look at that dog. That's a mammal. Look at that dog. That's a mammal. And look at that dog. That's also a mammal. Now, if you imagine that I created a synthetic dog in the lab, it would also be a mammal. Like that doesn't show that all mammals are dogs. So like just pointing to instances of things consistent with your hypothesis doesn't give us any particularly good reason to think that there couldn't be or aren't things inconsistent with it. So, Sam, I think consistently conflates the notion that well-being is at least part of, if not central to morality, with the notion that morality is only about well-being. And he often will frame this in terms of an incredulous opposition to people that reject well-being as an important foundation of well-being. So, sorry, of morality. So you'll have people that will say things like, morality is not about well-being, or I don't think well-being is important for morality. And then I'll say, okay, well, look at these people. They're clearly wrong. Morality, like that's an absurd position to take, that well-being is not part of morality. Okay, let's grant well-being is part of morality. Is it all of morality? I mean, this is as weird as making the mistake of saying, hey, I think broccoli is a vegetable, and there's people that think broccoli isn't a vegetable. That would be fine. But imagine if you went around saying broccoli is the only vegetable, and there's people that all these people keep denying broccoli is a vegetable. They're wrong. Clearly, broccoli is the only vegetable, and you're like, yeah, what about asparagus? So like, it's just there's something strange about the way he frames this, where that conflation, I think, it's not immediately obvious, but I think he might be making it.
No, I think that is actually a very good point, because that what you're trying to account for in the first place is like moral discourse, and that's a really varied thing that takes place in so many different ways across so many different domains of human life, from the interpersonal to sports to politics to all sorts, right? To the sciences. And the idea is that in theorizing, you're providing an overall account of all of those instances if you've got some general theory, right? And just to be able to point to like one or two cases where your theory happens to be right is just not all the data, because it's such a varied phenomena that you're trying to provide an account of. Like, it's just not going to do. So yeah, I think that was a great point about ignoring the kind of like fuzzy bits at the edges where the explanation might not fit so well.
Their sense of taste that cause them to prefer vanilla, in the same way that we currently treat people for curable forms of blindness. It seems to me that the boundary between mere aesthetics and moral imperative, the difference between not liking Matisse and not liking the Golden Rule, is more a matter of there being higher stakes and consequences that reach into the lives of other people than of there being distinct classes of facts regarding the nature of human experience. There's much more to be said on this point, of course, but I'll pass it by for the time being. In my view, morality must be viewed in the context of our growing scientific understanding of the mind. If there are truths to be known about the mind, there will be truths to be known about how minds flourish.
So I honestly think that this is, again, that unity of science thing doing so much of the work, where Sam's sort of thinking, if I know the relevant facts about minds, about just brain states individually or neuroscience or something, then I will be able to derive the relevant facts about all of the subjective states present in those brains. But the problem here is that so much of the way that our nervous systems work and our subjective states work is based off of historical contingency in the way that we've been trained, the way that our cultures are formed, and interpersonal relationships. And you can't derive those things merely by knowing the sort of like intrinsic physical facts about brains and things. You need to situate those facts in the context of history and social phenomena and so forth. And it's not that any of those things, history, social phenomena and so forth, are non-physical, but it's just that merely knowing the brain states isn't enough. And that's why Sam's kind of like reduction, I think, of morality isn't going to work, because that fuller understanding of what's considered moral or what's valued needs to take place in understanding the social context of humans and human nervous systems as humans as social creatures, rather than just the brains individually and sort of like deriving the facts directly to brain states or something.
That is about well-being altogether. Consequently, there will be truths to be known about right and wrong, and good and evil. Many critics of the moral landscape claim that my reliance on the concept of well-being was arbitrary and philosophically indefensible. Who's to say that well-being is important at all, or that other things aren't far more important? How?
Yeah, this is what I'm talking about. Like, okay, so some people might say, who's to say well-being is relevant at all? Someone, I think that actually is a legitimate question. You can have a moral theory that doesn't incorporate well-being into it. I think it would be perfectly intelligible to have a normative moral framework where you don't factor increases or decreases of well-being into it. I don't know why you would think that that's somehow not possible, or not as important. So I suspect there are people that will straight up say, I don't think well-being, like increases or decreases in well-being, is the most important thing. I actually think other considerations are more important. And there are people that think some amount of suffering in the world is a good thing. So they wouldn't want to just increase well-being and decrease suffering. At least some people will say stuff like, some degree of suffering is important for building character, and so does instrumental value. They might say that it has instrumental value for increasing well-being in the long term, but I don't think that's always true. I think that some people think that the possession of certain sorts of character traits are goods for their own sake, like being courageous or being tough or something like that. And being tough doesn't have to increase your well-being. You're just tough. And so I think people like certain character traits. They just like the traits, and they don't have to like them solely and exclusively in terms of the degree to which they're reducible to increasing or decreasing well-being. What are you doing?
50 Cent agrees with you, Lance. Sunny days wouldn't be special if it wasn't for rain. So how can it all reduce to well-being? You got to have the rain for the special sunny days.
Yeah, and people might say things like, I wouldn't want a life of like a perpetual orgasm or constant bliss. They would say something like, I'd rather my life be. So I've heard people say things like, I would rather live in a world with lots of happiness and a decent amount of being interesting versus a world that's only happiness but isn't interesting. And ask people questions like, look, imagine if we could wire your brain up so that your reward system and your perceptual system were synchronized such that you got immense, just the most ridiculous amount of joy from staring at like paint dry on a wall. Like you're just like, oh, this paint drying on the wall is just the most wonderful thing. And that's all you do. And we just put feeding tubes in you and you just stare at the wall watching the paint dry. And you're just in a state of rapture forever. Or, and we can give you the hedonic units, right? So the hedonic units are cashed out in terms like 1,000 units per second indefinitely for the next, indefinite amount of time, as long as we keep going. And then the other person, it's like, it's 100 today, it's negative 30 the next day, it's 74 the next day. Now, the problem is that, in other words, I would say in the second case, you have less well-being. Almost everybody, I think, would actually pick that second case. Not everybody would. You would have variation. And that's one of the important things that undermines this concern. Like, there are facts about how to promote human flourishing. Yeah, but those facts are going to vary from one person to another. So that might be a partial issue.
Across cultures as well, because cultures value different things.
Right. But Sam might say, okay, that's fine, but you could still navigate, or you could still approximate or arrive at peaks and valleys in the moral landscape.
But put your hand on a hot stove then. Where's the culture doing that? But I think the problem is that there are cultures that engage in like suicide traditions and things like that we just consider very like as horrible as possible sort of thing.
It's perfectly possible to not prioritize your well-being or anybody else's well-being over other considerations. So one, there's no logical incoherence or subtler problem with not caring about well-being, like logically speaking. And two, you certainly could have it not be the highest thing on your sort of list of priorities. Now, the issue might be that when Sam starts talking about what well-being is, he seems to use it as a catch-all term for any changes in conscious states that on reflection we care about, something like that. And so it ends up not being cashed out in any well-specified terms. Like I might say something like, I construe well-being as positive affective states. So there's a certain type of phenomenology that's associated with some of our experiences. That phenomenology is valenced in that it could be construed in terms of a sort of approach tendency. Like I desire more of that. It could be cashed out in quasi-behaviorist terms even. And then there's other sorts of behaviors that have this avoid. They're like sort of flagged with the phenomenology of less of this. I don't like this, avoid this. And we can cash it out in terms of there being these like distinct types of behavioral profiles
and phenomenological profiles to certain mental states, and we can construe well-being and suffering in those terms. And I think that would be a more narrow and substantive and sort of like empirically defensible conception of what well-being is. But if well-being is taken to encompass anything that a person says they could care about, so long as it is cashed out in terms of changes in conscious states. Okay, well, if we're being that indiscriminate, then would increasing fear in people be it an increase in well-being, provided you want that? You want to make other people terrified? I doubt it. And so we would need to bring in this notion of valence to the conscious states, would we not? So if we don't bring in the notion of valence, then apparently, then how do you distinguish well-being from suffering? Like, isn't suffering a negatively valenced phenomenological states? Like, so there's going to be an issue here where if we don't bring in substantive notions of valence that are cashed out in terms of distinct behavioral, dispositional, psychological, and phenomenological profiles, we're going to have a serious problem with his characterization of well-being being so underspecified that it's unclear how to carry it out, like what you do with it in practice. Like, how do you, okay, if this is supposed to be a scientific matter and we can empirically study using the tools of science how to increase and decrease well-being, you have to operationalize what you mean by well-being. How would you have a measure if the measure is so loose that, like, what counts as a measure? These questions would need to be answered, and having a loosey-goosey notion of well-being is just, it's not going to fly as far as science goes. Like, imagine if instead of saying, like, I don't know, temperature is kinetic energy or whatever, you just say temperature is anything we could conceivably care about to measure when it comes to ambient environmental effects. Whatever we could conceivably care about. And then one person's like, one person really is sensitive to like barometric pressure or something like that. So is that temperature? But everyone else isn't. So is your notion of temperature now contingent on variable features of the people that are investigating the issue? Like, what are you even doing at that point? That's a very weird kind of science at that point. One would think that you would operationalize your conception of temperature, and then there would be some consistent standard or metric for evaluating it. So I don't even know what he's talking. Like, hopefully we'll get to it when he talks about well-being, but it's just so vague and underspecified. It seems to me effectively useless from a scientific.
Well, because it is a grab bag of whatever he wants it to be.
Right.
Yeah.
Which unfortunately I think is strategically useful, because anything anybody says where, well, your theory doesn't address this normative moral issue, you could say, no, that's encompassed by well-being. And you say, okay, well, what if this other group of people want this entirely different outcome? Yeah, that's also so just everything's well-being. It's
and well-being.
If everything's well-being, then effectively nothing's well-being.
Yeah, well-being also explains temperature and the motions of the stars, right? Because I can just construe a conception of well-being such that it has everything that I need around the movements of the stars and whatever I measure on thermometers and things like that. But at that point, we're not really providing a theory that does anything, that unifies our knowledge, that slices thinly, that has a well-defined conception. So yeah.
How, for instance, could you convince someone who does not value well-being that he should value it? And even if one could justify well-being as the true foundation of morality, many have argued that one would.
And this is bizarre as well, because people do disagree about moral facts. So just assuming you're Sam, and I'm talking about first order moral disagreement, right? Now, assuming that you're Sam and you think that all moral discourse does in fact reduce to well-being, right, in some sense, well, then people do disagree about the well-being states all the time, because they disagree about the first order moral claims, right? And so they do try and persuade each other of one thing inducing more well-being or not. Well, even if they don't know that that's what they're doing, they're still doing it, right?
Yeah. So how would we use science to resolve philosophical disagreements about what well-being is?
Yeah, I think maybe Sam's suggestion would be that he would need to cash out some method for actually discerning, what induces the most well-being in the sense that he means, I guess. And that is all very vague, and there's no way of doing that, is there, really? I mean, maybe in some specific...
If you operationalize it in a way that's empirically tractable, then you could. How do you operationalize it? I don't recall him giving us any sort of like substantive operationalizations.
By the way, I want to head off one concern, which is like the remarks I made that there's nothing logically incoherent or any sort of philosophical problems with questioning well-being. I certainly could, like, I sometimes call myself now a retired utilitarian. I used to do normative moral philosophy, or at least think about it. I never really published or wrote about it in like formal academic settings. But I used to think of myself as a utilitarian. I just don't anymore. I'm kind of I'm a normative moral quietist about the whole domain of normative theory. But like well-being always was central to my view of morality myself. So I certainly put it front and center and consider it a priority. I just don't think that that's the only conceivable way to think about morality. And well, if I don't know if it's in this 28 minutes, but he ends up saying that if you anyone that claims to conceive of it otherwise is pretending. And that I just like, I hope we get to that, but I just have a huge issue with just so you just make an assertion, this is how it is. And if you disagree, saying they're pretending is basically saying that they're self-deceived or they're lying or they're confused. It's a pretty insulting, and it would never mind if it's insulting, because maybe his critics are all pretending. The problem is really, what's the evidence for that? Why should we believe, like if you look at the 2020 Phil Paper survey, only about a third of the philosophers endorse consequentialism. I know he doesn't like or use that label for his position, but you have, about 2/3 of them endorsing deontology and virtue ethics, and that's not going to reduce morality to well-being. So are all of these professional philosophers literally pretending? They're all pretending to disagree with Sam Harris. Like that's just maybe, but like I would want to see what the arguments or evidence for that is. And it appears that the only argument he tends to give is his personal incredulity that you could think differently than him.
Would need a metric by which it could be measured. Else there could be no such thing as moral truth in the scientific sense. There's an unnecessarily restrictive notion of science underlying this last claim, as though scientific truths only exist if we can have immediate and uncontroversial access to them in the lab.
I sort of think that this is a bit of a cop-out given what Sam just said, because I think that there should actually be some neural correlates for well-being given the previous claims that he made justifying why we should accept this theory in the first place, which is, the stuff about the well-being states being purely determined by physical states, which are objective in the ontological sense and all measurable and stuff like that, and laws of nature. So I think he should actually be saying that they will be measurable at some point. We just don't know the right way of doing it yet, right? But
a certain physicist, who will remain nameless here, was in the habit of saying things like, "I don't know what a unit of well-being is," as though he were regretfully delivering the killing blow to my thesis. I would venture that he doesn't know what a unit of sadness is either, and units of joy and disgust and boredom and irony and envy and schadenfreude or any other mental state worth studying won't be forthcoming. If half of what many scientists say about the limits of science were true, the sciences of mind are not merely doomed, there would be no facts for them to understand in the first place. Consider the possibility.
hang on, I need to rehear what I kind of zoned out, and it's
If half of what many scientists say about the limits of science were true, the sciences of mind are not merely doomed, there would be no facts for them to understand in the first place.
there would be no facts for them to understand in the first place. I'm not sure that that's right. The ability to quantify something or not means that there are no facts. I mean, I guess there's a sense in which you have to make some measurement, but I mean, people do psychology based off of individual reports. I mean, you're going to be much more well-versed than me on this lens, but there's all sorts of methodological approaches to psychology that are more contextual. I guess often maybe what you're doing is then maybe trying to perform statistical analyses on the sorts of things that people say and report or ways they behave. But it's not like, I suppose it's not like you think you're directly measuring some folk psychological predicate or something in units like you would temperature or something like that, and that's a requisite to be performing psychology.
What are you asking me a specific question?
Yeah. So the question is, on what Sam just said there, do you think do you agree with Sam that that's right? If you accept the claim that I don't know that there are units of sadness or units of happiness, then all psychological sciences are doomed.
No, absolutely
That's the question.
not.
Yeah,
No.
Yeah. So, with dealing with psychology, you are often measuring you're often measuring phenomena that are not cashed out in direct physical terms. Like if you're talking about like a personality trait, you don't have pieces of personality. You don't have a little bit of openness to experience here and a little bit of conscientiousness over there. That doesn't mean they're not real, but you have to understand, what it is that you're measuring. And if we want to set aside metaphysics, the way in which we access and make inferences about these sort of latent variables is by proxy. It's that we have some sort of measurable proxy that we use to make inferences about, and then we posit these psychological constructs to explain the observations and data that we have. So you're proceeding by some sort of abductive inference, your inference to the best explanation, using a model, you're testing that model. And so you might say, posit, well, if people exhibited these types of personality traits, then we would expect them to respond to questions in this sort of way, based on a bunch of assumptions about the general reliability of self-report. And then you would look at things like the predictive validity of your Big Five scale, for instance, by looking at, okay, well, if people that report being higher in conscientiousness would be expected to have higher earnings in their jobs. If we go and we look at people that report higher conscientiousness, do they earn more in their jobs? The answer appears to be yes. And so, boom, this is some evidence that's consistent with this hypothesis. Now, a lot of this stuff is really difficult to test, the causality, the underlying mechanisms, like what exactly is it about a person that says they're higher in conscientiousness that causes them to make more money, if in fact that's true. You don't necessarily know exactly what it is. And so there's a lot of background work that need to get done in a lot of these cases. The thing is, and there's like dozens and dozens of, maybe a couple hundred measures of depression. There are substantive disputes about how to operationalize this or that particular construct. And they're going to overlap and fail to overlap in varying ways and to varying degrees when you're developing your models. It's messy. It does not mean that there aren't underlying discoverable natural kinds and facts about human psychology, but that's not really the issue. That is really all an epistemic issue. And if one's concern was simply our epistemic access to developing models that make accurate predictions about human behavior, and we look at it in those terms, the epistemic issues are not in and of themselves going to jettison any concern about the studyability of well-being scientifically. The real issue is going to come, it's going to be a sort of something that would be the result of the iterative process of actually doing that research and studying actual human psychology. And what may come out of that is that there are qualitative distinctions between certain types of human mental states that are in a certain sense non-fungible or incommensurable. I don't suppose from the outset of inquiry that there is some fundamental unity across different types of mental states where if I experience, if a person experiences the pleasure associated with eating food, with having an orgasm, with having their back scratched, and the sense of satisfaction from achieving a job well done, that I don't see any reason to suppose that on scientific grounds, these must be fungible or incommensurable in terms of some measurable unit of good. Why should that be the case? Not everything in the universe can necessarily be cashed out in those sorts of quantitative terms. We could potentially make all sorts of quantitative and quantifiable predictions about human behavior, but in terms of cross-phenomenal fungibility, that itself, it's not a given that it must be commensurable, that you could compare some amount of eating cupcakes to an orgasm. Like, why would that necessarily be something that you should presume we're able to do? These distinctions could be qualitative, and you could end up getting ordinal and nominal sorts of distinctions rather than interval or ratio ones. Like, it's not just a given at the outset of inquiry that whatever is in the contents of human psychology, it must be cashed out in terms of some sort of universal currency that would be something that we would all converge on agreeing about. That's not a given.
What are your thoughts on this question then? If there were no natural kinds of human psychology at all, then there couldn't be a science of the human mind. Do you think that's right?
I don't know. I'd have to think about that. Yeah. No discoverable patterns, or there's no way to make
exactly.
predictions,
Yeah,
that
and
would be
that's
acceptable.
yeah.
But there obviously are patterns and distinctions that we could make.
Yeah, it's just
But the
whether or
issue
not.
is that there may be no, like, it sounds like the presumption is that, what I'm worried about is this presumption that all well-being can be cashed out in terms of like a universal currency.
Like a
Why would
psychological
we
primitive.
disagree?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's almost like it might be a useful simplification, because there's like clearly like, okay, let's take a range of like suffering experiences. Like they're stubbing your toe, getting a paper cut, getting an electric shock, getting like stabbed with a knife, getting beaten repeatedly with a baseball bat with barbed wire on it, and like getting set on fire. Like we can put those in an easy ranking. Set on fire is worse, stubbing your toe and paper cuts are probably the least bad. And like there is a degree of like clear fungibility between these types of qualitative mental states. We can make some sort of quantitative distinctions between them. But should we, is there some, like, it's not an epistemic question. Like, it's not like I am supposing when I look at stubbing your toe, getting set on fire, getting stabbed, that there is definitively some units of well-being experience. Like stubbing your toe is -5, is like 5 units of suffering. Getting stabbed is like 712, and then getting set on fire is like 4,619. Like, but it's just really hard to measure. And so really the issue is an epistemic barrier. No, I'm questioning like whether that even makes sense conceptually. Why would we think that these things all exist on a single continuum? Why think that? I just don't grant that as a presumption. And so if that's the case, how would you measure these things against one another? I think the answer is you wouldn't. You just wouldn't. Now, you could devise parochial. So it could be that were I to experience all of these states, I could assign some sort of ordinal ranking to them, where I could say, look, you inject in my mind, like the Matrix or whatever, like a simulation of all the possible, like some close space of possible experiential states I could have, and I experience them all in sequence, and I have, like, you enhance my memory, whatever. Like imagine the super rational being. And then I could say, okay, I could rank order these. But simply because I rank order them in a particular way, would that mean everyone, if they were fully informed, ideally rational, and had super brains too, that they would all rank order them the same way? I think the answer is no, they would not rank order them the same way. And so there is no shared universal metric of how to cash out our judgments about well-being. There are going to be individual parochialized ways of cashing things out in terms of my preferences and your preferences and somebody else's preferences. And I seriously, I mean, there's going to be edge cases and border cases where I'm like, you know what? I can't tell at this point. I'm going to encounter cases like that. There may, I mean, we're dealing with human brains. And so, you know, philosophers may love like the conservation, like transitivity, like if A is bigger than B and B is bigger than C, then obviously A must be bigger than C. But do human preferences and attitudes have to be cashed out in terms of preserving transitivity? I'm not sure that they do. And so it could turn out, you could discover, if you started rank ordering your judgments, that they are not rank orderable. It could be that you consider, like, you show me A and I'm like, yeah, A is better than B. Then you show me B and I'm like, yeah, B is better than C. And then you show me C and I'm like, actually, you know what? I like C better than A. And then I go and consider A and B again. And I'm like, but A is still better than B and B is still better than C, but I do like C better than A. And it could just be because human brains are weird, that is just how our judgments work. Now, if you exposed a person like me with, you know, a training in analytic philosophy to a failure of transitivity in my judgments, I might go, ugh, I don't want that in my mind. So I'm going to try to reach reflective equilibrium and really come down on this and think, no, C, I guess it is worse than A. But there's not like a requirement that human minds must conform to the rules of like classical logic. A person could just not do that. And so what would we discover? Like, what if we discover 41% of people just totally violate any sort of clear and coherent ordinal ranking of their experiences, even if you could put the matrix thing in their brain and have them rank everything. And there's just all sorts of inconsistencies. Okay, so we could discover, as a matter of psychological fact, the way in which human beings, even when they're fully informed and ideally rational, the way in which they categorize their experiences, there cannot be ordinally ranked in a clear and coherent way. And even to the extent that those ordinal rankings are possible, they're not even consistent from one person to another. What do we do there? That does seem to threaten what Harris is proposing, to me. But it's not. It doesn't make humans not subject to empirical inquiry. It just means that his particular project will be
it does.
fundamentally misguided.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Consider the possibility of a much, much saner world than the one we currently live in. Imagine that due to remarkable breakthroughs in technology and economics and psychological science and political skill, we created a genuine utopia on Earth. Needless to say, this wouldn't be boring, because we will have wisely avoided all the boring utopias. Rather, we will have created a global civilization of astonishing creativity and security and happiness. However, let's imagine that some people weren't ready for this earthly paradise once it arrived. Some were psychopaths who, despite enjoying the general change in quality of life, were nevertheless eager to break into their neighbors' homes and torture them just for kicks. A few had preferences that were incompatible with the flourishing of whole societies. Try as he might, Kim Jong-un just couldn't shake the feeling that his cognac didn't taste as sweet without millions of people starving beyond his palace gates. Given our advances in science, however, we are now able to alter preferences of this kind. In fact, we can painlessly deliver a firmware update to everyone. Imagine that we do that, and now the entirety of the species is fit to live in a global civilization that is as safe and as fun and as interesting and as creative and as filled with love as it can be. It seems to me that this scenario cuts through the worry that the concept of well-being might leave out something that is worth caring about.
I mean, given that Sam used many different words to describe what that world would be like, safe, fun, loving, and the point in question is whether Sam's idea of this one psychological feeling, basically, is what all of those things reduce to. And it isn't clear to me, for example, that, like love, from my point of view, encapsulates things like duties, right? And doing things that, in fact, make you not feel good because there's a deeper, maybe long-term sense of gratification in that or something. So, I think it's worth noting that Sam hasn't done a good job of showing how his notion of this one sort of psychological state really does adequately relate to all of the different terms that he wanted to kind of say in the thought experiment would be what it would be to have, to maximize that in the thought experiment world: love, safety, belonging, so forth.
For if you care about something that is not compatible with a peak of human flourishing, given the requisite changes in your brain, you would recognize that you were wrong to care about this thing in the first place. Wrong in what sense? Wrong in the sense that you didn't know what you were missing. This is the core of my argument. I'm claiming that there must be frontiers of human well-being that await our discovery. And certain interests and
I wonder what he means by frontiers there. Does he mean ways that people can feel that are even better than anything we felt before?
Yeah,
Or-
I think he does mean
yeah.
that. But how is that the core of his argument? Like, who would disagree
Yeah.
that there are possible types of experiences people could be having and lives we could be living that are much better than the current ones with respect to increases in well-being, however that's construed?
But here's the thing, though, is are those feelings actually going to be better than the feelings that, say, like someone who dies of a heroin overdose gets, like, just before they die? I don't know.
I don't know, but I think it's plausible that people would say that on reflection, I would rather live that kind of life than the heroin overdose kind of life. And I'm fine with that. It's just that I just don't grant that we just need to accept that that's what morality is all about. That morality is all about how good our lives go. That's just not historically or typically how everybody construes morality. They would say that's part of morality. And part of morality is the kind of person you are, the kind of virtues you cultivate, and the kind of rules you follow. There are certain rules. You shouldn't do certain things, and you should do other sorts of things, independent of their consequences or their impact on well-being. And there's nothing unintelligible about this. There's nothing incoherent about this. And I see absolutely no reason to think that people that say this and think this way and feel this way are in any respect pretending or being insincere or in any way confused. Simply because it's like, imagine if a utilitarian just went around saying, anyone who's not a utilitarian is conceptually confused and they have no idea what they're talking about. They're all pretending not to be utilitarians. You just got to be a utilitarian. It's just so damn obvious. This would be a profoundly weird and unconvincing way to argue for your position, to simply insist everyone already agrees with you and everybody's strictly utilitarian. I don't go around telling moral realists, well, because anti-realism is so obvious to me, you must be an anti-realist. And if you claim to be a realist, you're just pretending. Everybody stop pretending, because they have access to their minds. I don't have telepathy. They are going to know whether I'm right or wrong
if I said this, they're going to go, you're full of shit. I don't think that. And they're not going to take me very seriously. It's not very dialectically effective to just declare everybody that disagrees with you confused or lying or whatever, and to just go around being flabbergasted at people not thinking the way that you do. Maybe when people don't think the way that you do, it's not whether or not they're correct or not, they actually don't think the way that you do. And you're just wrong when you say, but you can't not think like me. Everyone has to think like me. Again, it's a weird irony that Sam is exhibiting all the hallmarks of like the worst vices of bad analytic philosophy, which is this, sometimes I've said philosophy is like psychology with a sample size of one. And, Sam Harris just not only has a sample size of one, but seems to think that one is like is super awesome and it's the best one of all. And it just gets everything right in the first go. And
preferences surely blind us to them. In this sense, epistemic and ethical values are fully entangled. There are horizons to well-being past which we cannot see. There are possible experiences of beauty and creativity and compassion that we will never discover. I think these are objective statements about the frontiers of subjective experience. However, it is true that our general
I really don't
morality-
get why every time he feels he can sort of talk about something subjective in an objective way as well, he says it as if he's making like a really profound point there. Like, I think that there are states of well-being people can have that are better than the ones that anyone has now. I think that that's an objective statement about subject. It's like, why is that like a point that really vindicates all of the kind of theory that you've stated before? I don't get. I really don't get.
Yeah,
that.
there is something very strange about it. It's like it seems as though he discovered the fact that there are objective facts about our subjective preferences, states, attitudes, concerns.
Like, everyone's in denial about this, but me, I figured it out.
Yeah, I figured out that hey, if this person thinks stealing is wrong and that other person thinks stealing isn't wrong, it's an objective fact that this person thinks stealing is wrong and that person doesn't think stealing is wrong. Boom, look at that. There are objective facts about subjective facts. This is trivially true. Anybody that like engages with meta ethics, this would make someone roll their eyes. Like it's a very trivial point to make, and he presents it as though he's arguing with some opposition that doesn't agree with him. And maybe he is, but maybe your position shouldn't be pitched at trying to enlighten the stupidest possible people. And you should instead present a position that's accurate, and meaningful, and makes sense. I mean, imagine if I went around saying, "Hey," like, because parallel his like, imagine if I said, "Look, central to my point about gastronomy is there are horizons of the culinary arts that we have yet to come across. There are foods, has anyone decided to make a pineapple, I don't know, something, blue cheese stromboli? That sounds really horrible. And it would you would eat that and it would just blow your mind and it would be the greatest thing you ever ate. Or maybe there's food on other planets. Like maybe there's some weird, we're going to travel the stars and we'll find the weirdest things in the other worlds. There are horizons of gastronomic experiences and it's an objective fact that we could go to that planet and eat that food. We could eat some like fried Zorlons or something, and it would just absolutely blow our mind. And it's an objective fact that could happen. Yeah, sure. It's an objective fact. We could really like alien food. What was your point? I don't know why he dwells on this as if it's this magnificent, transcendent insight. It just strikes me as fairly prosaic. I don't really know what the dispute is.
I think, though, because Sam talks like this so confidently so often, that this is where a lot of the people who then engage with Sam will sort of like parrot some of these points, like, oh, everyone is confused about objective subjective distinction, but really Sam's figured it out and he's got, like, they'll assume that they're now in on this profound insight, that there are objective scientific claims that you can make about subjective experience, and they'll assume everyone else is confused about that. When actually, usually it's kind of they're the ones who are confused about the ways of using this sorts of language, but they think that they're ahead of the game because Sam talked about it really confidently and they've adopted that approach now.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that sort of ambient feedback that he gets from people can serve to reinforce that. Like, imagine I had 5 misconceptions about moral realism. They're all wrong. Like, moral realists didn't say these things. And then I went around saying, look, there's 5 misconceptions that people just don't understand realism and anti-realism, and here are the misconceptions. And I say super confidently, if I had a large following, people might go, yeah, people misunderstand meta ethics in these 5 ways, and they'll say it over and over and over and over and over.
And it would be really confusing to people that understand the topic, because they'd be like, that's not even our view. And these are not the central issues. These are actually pretty mundane points, and we actually agree with them.
Yeah, right.
And then those boring people, let's not listen to them. Trust me, these are the problems. You can create, in other words, I think he may risk creating a functional echo chamber for himself that reinforces his mistakes and insulates him from self-correction.
Right.
And that, if that's what's happened, that's a pretty big problem.
Does not require that we maximize global well-being. There's this tension, for instance, between what may be good for us and what may be good for society. And much of ordinary morality is a matter of our grappling with this tension. We're selfish to one degree or another, and we lack complete information about.
I find it interesting that why would Sam concede that there is a tension between these two, and ordinary morality is an attempt to trade off these two, but not accept that in fact there is one correct answer and it all reduces to one of them? Because he seems willing to accept, for example, that it's just it reduces down to just one of these two, and not that there might be other things people care about, such as, duties or whatever, that also are in that mix of what things that people are trying to trade off, right? So why is it that Sam draws the line just here at like this sense of well-being, and just these two for the group as a whole, or myself individually? It seems unprincipled to do it that way, rather than assume, actually, no, it all is just about that there's a correct answer. It all just comes down to individual, or it all just comes down to group. I don't think that Sam is really considering why he's drawing the lines, where he's drawing them, and providing good reasons for doing that.
The consequences of our actions. And even where we have sufficient information, our interests and preferences often lead us to ignore it. But our failures to be motivated to seek higher goods, or to motivate others to seek them, do not suggest that no higher goods exist. In what sense can an action be morally good? And what does it mean to make a good action better? For instance, it seems good to me to buy my daughter a birthday present, all things considered, because it will make both of us happy. Few people would fault me for spending some of my time and money in this way. But what about all the little girls in the world who suffer terribly at this moment for want of resources? Here's where an ethicist like Peter Singer will pounce, arguing that there actually is something morally questionable, possibly even reprehensible, about my buying my daughter a birthday present, given my knowledge of how much good my time and money could do elsewhere. What should I do? Singer's argument makes me uncomfortable, but only for a moment, because it's simply a fact about me that the suffering of other little girls is often out of sight and out of mind, and my daughter's birthday is no easier to ignore than an asteroid impact. Can I muster a philosophical defense of my narrow focus? Perhaps. It might be that Singer's argument leaves out some important details. For instance, what would happen if everyone in the developed world ceased to shop for birthday presents and all other luxuries? Might the best of human civilization just come crashing down upon the worst? How can we spread wealth to the developing world if we do not create vast wealth in the first place? These reflections, self-serving and otherwise, land me in a toy store looking for something that isn't pink. So yes, it is true that my thoughts about global well-being didn't amount to much in this instance, and yet most people wouldn't judge me for it. But what if there was a way for me to buy my daughter a birthday present and also cure another little girl of cancer at no extra cost? Wouldn't this be better than just buying the original present? What if there was a button I could push near the cash register that literally cured a distant little girl somewhere of cancer? Imagine if I declined the opportunity to push this button, saying, "What is that to me? I don't care about other little girls and their cancers." Of course, that would be monstrous, and it's only against an implicit notion of global well-being that we can judge my behavior to be less good than it might otherwise be. It is true that no one currently demands that I spend my time seeking in every instance to maximize global well-being, nor do I demand that of myself. But if global well-being could be maximized, that would...
I guess so. The point that one could make is, why does he not just provide that further reduction and say, well, the only reason that he cares about global well-being is because it increases his individual well-being, and now there's only one type of reduction to individual well-being or something. Like, I sort of, in general, don't really, I feel like the point he made in a really, really roundabout way. I think he's just saying, like, I don't always care that much about global well-being, and now he's saying, but there are cases where I do. And I guess he's not kind of got to his full conclusion for that whole piece yet, so maybe being a bit preemptive. But I don't think he's really sort of like providing a very good argument or good reasons and good reflections on why he's constructed his theory the way he has again, and what exactly those trade-offs are between global and local sort of well-being. Like I don't think he's really providing some deep insight beyond just the mere observation that sometimes he does care about it and sometimes he doesn't. I kind of don't get it.
This is a more general problem with it, which is with his account, which is that in normative ethics, philosophers deal with issues in population ethics and the distribution of well-being. So you could ask a question like this: you have 3 kids, and you're going to give them resources throughout the course of their lives, and let's say like the minimum for a decent life is like 5 units, and you have 2 options for how many units to give to your kids. You could do 1, 1, and 30, or you could do like 10, 10, and 10. Now, I suspect almost everybody would pick the 10, 10, and 10, although technically that's 30 total units, and it's less than the 32 units you would have if you distributed them unevenly. And so people are going to favor a fair and even distribution of goods over a total higher amount. Now, how does his account address that? Which should you do? Now, he could say, well, there's just different peaks on the moral landscape. Okay, is one of the peaks higher than the other? How do we adjudicate that question? I don't think he's presented us with the normative, philosophical, theoretical like principles or tools for addressing basic normative moral questions like the distribution of goods or well-being. How does he address distribution? I don't think he addresses that. I don't recall seeing anything like that. And so you're going to have an issue like that. You're going to have an issue of how much of a personal prerogative do we have? So how much can I prioritize my well-being or the well-being of people that I care about more or whatever over the well-being of others that I care less about? How much does my personal concern or connectedness to people factor in to my personal obligations? So, science tells us what does or doesn't increase well-being. Okay, how is that actionable for me from a first-person point of view when I'm going about deliberating and making decisions? What do I do as an individual? So classic normative ethics, like, look, I am extremely critical of classic normative ethics, but they at least like to put it one way, they understand what the assignment is. They understand what problems we're trying to solve. They understand that individuals need to deliberate and go about making decisions. How do they go about doing that? They need to. They understand that individuals have conflicts between their self-interest and the welfare of others. How do we go about doing that? They understand that there are questions about what kind of institutions to devise. And they go about writing about that and discussing that. And normative ethics ends up leading into political philosophy and applied ethics. And you have a whole manner of subfields of applied ethics. There's business ethics, healthcare ethics, research ethics. There is an extraordinary amount of ethical, philosophical work being done. Now, is it all high quality? No, there's going to be problems and people are going to do bad work or thoughtless work or negligent work or careless work. But they do so against a backdrop of constructs, constructions, categories, distinctions, ideas, thoughts, theories, accounts. You have like roles, and you have all these views in applied ethics about how to handle this issue or that issue. And Harris doesn't even begin to scratch the outer layer of the coating of the box that you would remove before you scratch the surface of that topic. Like, he doesn't even come anywhere near close to addressing it. Like, it's not like he provides a crude and unnuanced account of all of these things. He doesn't provide an account at all. And we already have a vast and expansive literature on all of these issues in normative, applied, and metaethics, which he just dismisses as boring. It's too boring to look at. What do you mean? Oh, it's boring to look at the people that have actually thought about these fucking questions? I mean, are you kidding me? Sorry if I get a little bothered by it, but it's like what he's offering us is so unactionable and useless when it comes to normative theory and applied ethics. It's although I guess technically he didn't dismiss those as boring, that it's just that there's just so much that could be said on these topics. And he's presenting himself as providing solutions that are so underdeveloped. Imagine I went into the culinary arts. I like my gastronomic examples. And I said, look, I think that when it comes down to making better or worse food, it's all about taste. It's all about taste. And there are discoverable facts about what food people would find tastier and what food people wouldn't find tastier. Done. I'm done. And then everyone else is like, all these like culinary people are like, yeah, I have my theory of like how you need to balance like umami and sweetness and savoriness, and like this other person is like, yeah, well, also textures are a factor here. And so texture is important to taste, and another person's like, hold up. It's not just about the physical properties of the food, like texture and taste. I agree with all that, but it's also about the cultural background and the dynamic relation and historical associations a person has with the food and how that food relates to their personal experiences in the culture. And so it's like you have all that work there, and someone just goes, nope, screw all that. I'm going to ignore all that. It's all about tastiness, and there are scientific facts. Did you know that when you eat food and you have like taste receptors in your tongue, and like, did you know that your olfaction is involved in taste and smell perception of food, and that it's all involved? And did you know that there's parts of the brain that are associated with interpreting taste and smell stimuli? There are facts about that. And, everyone else could roll their eyes and go, yeah, no shit, there's facts about that. You're not even, so what? So what? I don't see a big difference here. I think he's offering us something that I wouldn't even say it's half baked or a quarter baked or an eighth baked. It's like a millionth baked of such an incomplete, underdeveloped, and useless account when it comes to being actionable when it comes to almost any question in normative or applied ethics. I just don't. It's a big bag of nothing to me.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, imagine we disagreed about some first order issue and Sam's right. How can we resolve it using anything Sam said? How can we use Sam's insights to do anything?
Yeah, I think we can't. I think it's pretty much practically useless.
Would be much better, by the only definition of better that makes any sense.
You're muted.
I was going to say, and for the people who might be sort of reflexively thinking to that, well, Sam's theory is that it's well-being, so we just go with what maximizes well-being. The problem is it's so underdeveloped that means anything, right? There's no way of us settling which of the views maximizes well-being and in which sense, over which time scale, in which ways. Like, yeah. So.
Right, because for him, he doesn't clearly align himself with like a total aggregate hedonic utility account. I mean, he seems to explicitly eschew any of the sort of conventional normative theories. He distances himself from consequentialism. So he's not committing himself to a total view. So it could be that he would think that a higher peak on the moral landscape is one where everybody gets 10 units of good, rather than one where the total amount is 10% higher, but it's extremely unevenly distributed, where a bunch of people get ones and a bunch of people get 30s. He might say the second one has less overall well-being in it, because, for instance, it wouldn't be the world we would want. And hey, that a world that we don't want, that's cashed out in terms of conscious experiences. It's about our desires. We don't want the second world with an asymmetric distribution. So boom, actually, what we don't want, that's encompassed in this concept of well-being. Okay, but he doesn't specify. So how do we know? Is there a fact of the matter about which one is better on his view? How do we find out? So his notion of well-being is likewise so underdeveloped and inchoate and not well specified that it is unclear how one could in principle use it to address even the most basic questions like the distribution of well-being in a society. So for instance, how would he address the repugnant conclusion? How would he address basic issues in population ethics? How does he address the non-identity problem? How does he address any of these sorts of issues that philosophers working in normative philosophy deal with on a regular basis? I don't know how his account would deal with them. Now, he could add things. Maybe he'll watch this video, say, here's the answers, and they're all obvious. So why did you idiots even question me on this? Well, why didn't you put that in the original book? Instead, it's just a bazillion trillion examples about like neuroscience. Who gives a shit? So it's just like, even if he does have answers to these questions, where are they and why isn't he presenting them? You know what a normative philosopher, a normative moral philosopher, like a professional philosopher, you know what they would do? They would write a damn paper or book about it, and then they would go publish it. And then they say it's in this paper. He didn't do that. Again, to my knowledge, maybe he did and I'm not aware of it. In that case, I apologize. Yeah. But like, again, like the dismissiveness of people that actually work on these issues professionally and on a consistent basis, there are whole literatures that address these sorts of questions. And we're not told about any of that. He doesn't significantly engage with any of it.
I believe that this is an objectively true statement about subjective reality in this universe. The fact that we might not be motivated by a moral truth doesn't suggest that moral truths don't exist. Some of this comes down to confusion over a prescriptive rather than descriptive conception of ethics. It's a difference between should and can. Whatever our preferences and capacities are at present, regardless of our failures to persuade others or ourselves to change our behaviors, our beliefs about good and evil must still relate to what is ultimately possible for human beings. And we can't think about this deeper reality by focusing on the narrow question of what a person should do in the gray areas of life, where we spend so much of our time. It is rather the extremes of human experience that throw sufficient light by which we can see that we stand upon a moral landscape. For instance, are members of the Islamic State wrong about morality? Yes. Really wrong? Yes. Can we say so from the perspective of science? Yes. If we know anything at all about human well-being, and we do,
even that is like, which bits of it, right? It's like, so if they say it's good, so the first US person to be killed by ISIS was Judea Pearl's son. Fun fact for you. So what if supposing that the ISIS members who did that thought that it was a good thing, maybe we might say that they're wrong about it, right? But then suppose that a member of ISIS says, US foreign policy is creating certain types of instability in the Middle East, and we don't want them interfere. Are they morally wrong about all of their claims by virtue of being a member of ISIS? Are they morally wrong about some specific claim? I just don't really know what Sam is saying, and I don't understand how this idea that we can point to some clear-cut examples where the vast majority, it's not even that it's logically impossible or even physically inconceivable, because there are examples of people who become neo-Nazis or advocate for all sorts of atrocities that the vast majority of people would agree are horrible things, right? But it's not clear what these like poles of experience that are supposed to do. Like, how is it that we've got two extreme experiences where maybe a lot of people can agree that they would say one of those is bad and one of those is good. But now what does that do for us? How do we fill in the rest? Like, because what if the rest is unrelated from the feelings and emotions and relevant considerations in those two extreme cases? I just don't know how this does as much work as Sam gets it to do for him.
Yeah, well, I mean, let's just grant that morality consists of facts about what increases or decreases well-being. Well, what should you do if that's just not what you personally care about? So you just don't, you've thought about it, you've considered it, and you're like, fine, let's call those the moral facts. You'll say that my actions are wrong if they're not about increasing well-being and they do increase suffering. And I don't care. Now what? Does he have anything to say to those people? Like what? Because if it turns out as a matter of psychological fact, a majority of people's moral values, like they don't have to be, like, because we could bring up like aliens from another world or an AGI that just wants to turn everything into paper clips or whatever. Those sorts of beings would just say, yeah, I don't care if that's moral or not. I don't care because I just want to turn everything into paper clips. And then they could proceed to do so. What's weird about that is that being, it seems like they could say, yeah, I agree my actions are immoral and I'm not motivated. And Sam might say that's fine. But then just consider actual human beings that just are not personally concerned with increasing a sort of broad increase or decrease in well-being. They have other concerns. Should they care about his account? Because he could say, but don't you understand? This world gives you more well-being than that world. This move through the moral landscape gives you more well-being than that move through the moral landscape. And they look at that and they go, I agree with you about that. And that's not the only thing I want. I want these other things. And I need to trade off increases or decreases in my well-being or the well-being of people in general against my other concerns, which you have declared are non-moral. Okay, let's grant that they're not moral. I don't care. I still care about them. So let's say I have all these schmoral concerns, and it's all the things that Sam Harris thinks are not moral. Okay, now what do I do if I have all these schmoral concerns and they're weighing against my moral concerns? Now what do I do? How do we address that question? And so this is still, like, in terms of this being actionable, like his sort of discoverable descriptive facts about what increases or decreases well-being, there's still going to be this further consideration, which is, as a matter of descriptive psychological fact, if individual humans their values are not perfectly aligned with that,
there's still going to be a question of what, practically speaking and deliberatively speaking, they ought to do in light of these facts. And again, we could just grant that the only moral facts are facts about well-being and suffering, and then that person could just say, that's fine, then I'm going to have to weigh those facts against all the other things I care about. I don't see how, what would be his refutation of that? Those people could just say, I don't care about those things. And I suspect, as a matter of descriptive empirical fact, we would discover on further inquiry that most people don't align with construing morality exclusively in terms of well-being. And so it would turn out that his program just wouldn't be particularly practical or actionable for most people in the world, given their own values.
I think another thing about what he's saying is that, you know, certain states of affairs seem to lead to exactly opposite amounts of well-being for different individuals. So you might say, you know, being in a music festival or something like that. Well, there are people who love being at a music festival, and there are people like me who being at a music festival would cause them lots of distress because they don't like all the noise and being around people, don't understand it. And so, you know, does that mean music festivals are then morally good, or are they morally bad? Like, what do you know, there's no consistent fact of the matter about how human psychology responds to some particular state of affairs. And I think Sam needs there to be some particular determined psychological fact of the matter in order for there to be this kind of like consistently, it is good for X to happen, or it is bad for X for Y to happen, or whatever as well. Okay.
We know that the Islamic State is not leading anyone, including themselves, toward a peak on the moral landscape. We know to a moral certainty that human life can be better than it is in a society where they routinely decapitate people for being too rational. When I wrote The Moral Landscape, I didn't appreciate how much ethical philosophy was conflated with concerns about personal motivation and public persuasion. For instance, it's widely imagined that a belief that one act is truly better than another, that is, that moral truths exist, must entail a commitment to acting in the prescribed way, that is, motivation. It must also rest on reasons that can be effectively communicated to others, that is, persuasion. If, for instance, I believe that I would be a better person and the world a marginally better place if I were a vegetarian, this is a possible moral truth, then many people expect that I must be motivated to exclude meat from my diet, and I must be able to persuade others to do likewise. The fact that I'm not sufficiently motivated to do this suggests that my presumed knowledge of moral truth is specious. Either no such truths exist, or I do not in fact know them. The common idea is that for a moral claim to be objectively true, it must compel a person to follow it. Real values must cause action.
The common belief is that for a moral claim to be objectively true, it must motivate. I don't know if that's common, but
I don't know how common it is, but it's certainly a view that at least some moral philosophers are going to take course. So some type of motivational internalism.
That's true. Yeah, but it's the claim that that's common that I don't know, but yeah.
Yeah, did he say common among philosophers or among people in general? I don't know.
I think, let me just...
Or I do not in fact know them. More likewise. The fact that I'm not sufficiently motivated to do this suggests that my presumed knowledge of moral truth is specious. Either no such truths exist, or I do not in fact know them. The common idea is that for a moral claim to be objectively true, it must compel a person to follow it. Real values must cause...
Yeah, he just has the common view. He's not specific there. That seems fine.
...cause action. Not contingently, not in combination with other motives, but absolutely. And they in turn constitute rational reasons for such action. Otherwise, the philosopher David Hume would be right, and the only way for claims about moral truth to be effective is for them to be combined with some associated passion or desire. Reason alone would be useless. But this paints an unrealistic picture of the human mind. But let's take a simpler case. Let's say that I want to lose 10 pounds. As it happens, I do, and I have absolutely no doubt that losing 10 pounds is possible. Okay, this is a biological truth. I also know that I would be marginally happier for having lost those pounds. This is a psychological truth. I'm also quite certain that I understand the process by which pounds can be lost. I need only eat less than I generally do and persist until I've lost the weight. This is another biological truth. These beliefs are cognitively valid in that they describe objective truths.
Cognitively valid.
So I went up and I went and looked up the survey results because I thought there might be a 2020 field paper survey question on this, and there is. So you could see I linked it in the chat. Moral motivation, internalism or externalism. So the view he's talking about is motivational internalism, And it does turn out to be the most popular view among academic philosophers on the matter by a very small margin. So 41% of philosophers endorse motivational internalism, and then 39% endorse externalism. And then you have about a quarter endorsing other sorts of views. So it is a common view among philosophers. So fair enough on that.
About my body and mind, and about how I would feel in a possible future. I am totally unconflicted in my desire to lose the weight, in that I valid, in that they describe objective truths about my body and mind, and about how I would feel in a possible future. I am totally unconflicted in my desire to lose the weight.
I'm unconflicted in my desire to lose the weight. I can't understand how those beliefs, without a desire to lose weight, to change physical state, would do anything for him in the thought experiment that he's created here, where he just has a bunch of true beliefs about his weight, a weight he would be healthier at. I can't understand how, if he doesn't desire, like, because that's what happens, isn't it? It's not like there's plenty of people who understand how to lose weight and just don't care how to, and so they don't. It's not like their true beliefs about the way that they could lose weight and that they would be healthier if they lost weight make them engage in behaviors where they lose weight. So I don't understand it. Like, again, though, this is another case where Sam's appealing to a hypothetical where what you think the outcome of the hypothetical is going to be determined wholly by your acceptance or denial of the conclusion that it's supposed to establish in the first place anyway. So it's not very useful.
This, unfortunately, is very common for hypotheticals. So,
Yeah.
People get Mary's room and other sorts of cases. And I'm just like, but, well, in virtue of my commitments, I'm not going to think that that's the case. But I also, it's not like I have like a lot of times philosophers will think that everybody shares the same intuitions and then the skeptics have to override them. And it's just not typically true for me across many issues. But then they'll also just act like I'm idiosyncratic or weird when they do this, but then they don't consider the broader population and fail to appreciate that when you induct people into a field where you say, this is the intuitive response, and you could disagree with it, but it's still the intuitive response, and you tell everybody that from the outset, you're going to get a lot of people that just comply or conform. I'm somebody that stuck around despite not having all these intuitions floating around in my head. But I don't know what my point is at that, other than just to say that there is an issue with relying too extensively on thought experiments and presuming that one's own reaction to them is or ought to be shared by others.
In that I absolutely want to lose it. Unfortunately, that's not all I want. I also want to eat ice cream, preferably once a day. The fact that I'm not sufficiently motivated to shun ice cream says nothing at all about my unconflicted desire to be thinner or the accuracy of my understanding of how to lose weight. My desire for ice cream is an independent fact about me, and gratifying this desire has consequences. The point, of course, is that we can know what is true without any doubt, and yet our knowledge is not guaranteed to produce behavior that is
Okay, so maybe he agreed with me with the point he was making, I don't know.
aligned with
And then I don't understand how that's in tension with the Humean view that you need a desire to motivate the action. But
truth. Such failures of will do not suggest that the relevant truths are just fictions. At this point, I think we should differentiate three projects that seem to me to be easily conflated, but which are in fact distinct and independently worthy endeavors. The first project is to understand what people do in the name of, quote, morality. We can look at the world, witnessing all of the diverse behaviors and cultural norms and institutions, and morally salient emotions like empathy and disgust. And we can study how these things affect human communities, both now and throughout history. We can examine all of these phenomena in as non-judgmental a way as possible and seek to understand them. We can understand them in evolutionary terms, and in any present generation, we can understand them in psychological and neurobiological terms. And we can call the fruits of this effort a, quote, science of morality. This would be a purely descriptive science of a sort that many scientists have begun to build. And for most scientists, this descriptive project seems to exhaust all the legitimate points of contact between science and morality. But I think there are two other projects we could concern ourselves with, which are arguably more important. The second project would be to actually understand how good human life could be. This would require that we get clearer about what we mean and should mean by terms like right and wrong and good and evil. We would need to understand how our moral intuitions relate to human experience altogether, and to use this understanding to think more intelligently about how to maximize human well-being. Of course, philosophers may think this begs some of the important questions, and I'll get back to that. Again, the lurking question is, What makes well-being important? But assuming for the moment that it is important, understanding how to maximize it is a distinct project. How good could human life be? And how can we get there? How do we avoid making the mistakes that would prevent us from getting there? What are the paths upward on the moral landscape? The third project is a project of persuasion. How can we persuade all of the people who are committed to silly and harmful things in the name of, quote, morality, to change their commitments and to lead better lives? I think this third project is actually the most important project facing humanity at the moment. It subsumes everything else we could care about, from arresting climate change, to reducing the risk of nuclear war, to curing cancer, to saving the whales. Any effort that requires that we collectively get our priorities straight and marshal our time and resources.
To stopping vaccine skepticism about the lab leak hypothesis, to stopping racially motivated Islamophobia and xenophobia, to stopping IDW misinformation, polluting political discourse. Oh no, sorry, Sam, those aren't important. Lance can remain neutral on Sam's political beliefs and other opinions, but I think it's just funny that Sam makes this point that if only people were to agree with him on his moral theory, then they would sort of act more morally in all these realms, and we'd resolve all these other problems that are the upshots of morality in the world, because they become clear when his sort of personal conduct in the sphere of politics has enabled a lot of misinformation, harmful political beliefs, people with bizarre sort of views around eugenics and things like that. And so in Sam's case, at least, having these moral beliefs is not determining the right course of moral action, right, when it comes to these things.
Fall within the scope of this project. To build a viable global civilization, we must begin to converge on the same economic and political and environmental goals. Obviously, the project of moral persuasion is very difficult, but it strikes me as especially difficult if you can't figure out in what sense anyone could ever be right or wrong about questions of human values. Understanding right and wrong in universal terms is Project 2, and that's what I'm focused on. Now, there are impediments to thinking about Project 2. The main one being that most right-thinking, well-educated people, certainly most scientists and public intellectuals, and I suspect most journalists, have been convinced that something in the last 200 years of our intellectual progress has made it impossible to actually speak about moral truth. Not because human experience is so difficult to study, or the brain too complex, but because there's thought to be no intellectual basis from which to say that anyone is ever really right or wrong about questions of value. My aim in the moral landscape was to undermine this assumption, because I think it was based on several fallacies and double standards, and frankly on some bad philosophy. And apart from being just wrong, this view has terrible consequences. For instance, in 1947, when the United Nations was attempting to formulate a universal declaration of human rights, the American Anthropological Association stepped forward and said that it just couldn't be done. So this would be...
Did you want to step in, Lance?
He's got, like, what he's going to do here reminds me a lot of people saying that atheism has terrible consequences, as if atheism entails some specific view. I reject moral realism. That does not entail that I'm going to endorse some sort of just being okay with any culture performing any practice and being totally indifferent to the welfare of people outside of my own culture. That's not an entailment of denying realism. That's a substantive, normative moral view. It has nothing to do with your meta-ethical views. Now, it could, well, sorry, I shouldn't say that. I should say some meta-ethical views are structured in a way where they are tied to one's normative moral views. So, if you endorse some type of agent relativism or something like that, then you might think that the moral facts that are authoritative or binding on people are fixed by the standards of those people's subjective judgments or the standards of their culture. And then you would think that because you're an agent cultural relativist, that therefore, if some culture approves of some practice, it is in fact morally good for them to engage in that practice, or less morally permissible. And so you are obligated not to interfere or abstain or to condemn them. Now, you could endorse a view like that, but notice that is both a meta-ethical view and a normative moral view. And it's the normative moral views that are doing the work there of making that such a repugnant position, because it would mean that if some culture thinks like human sacrifice is okay, then it is in fact okay. The other thing I would note about that type of agent cultural relativism is it's a very weird type of relativism. I don't know of any, I'm not familiar with any moral philosopher endorsing it. It doesn't mean that they don't. It's just, that's not a position that's typically advocated by most people that work in academic metaethics and emphasize anti-realist positions. Most of them are going to be error theorists, some type of non-cognitivist, maybe a quasi-realist, maybe some type of relativist. But if they are, they're probably going to be some kind of appraiser relativist. If you look at, for instance, the SEP entry on moral relativism, they draw this distinction between agent appraiser relativism. And just very quickly, agent relativism holds that whether an action is right or wrong depends on the standards of the agent performing the action or that agent's culture. Appraiser relativism says that whether an action is right or wrong depends on the standards of the agent evaluating the action or their culture. And so if you're an appraiser relativist and there's some culture where they engage in human sacrifice or they eat people alive or whatever, you could say, okay, well, I consider their actions wrong, and they are wrong relative to your standards, and they might be permissible relative to the standards of members of that culture, but that doesn't have any normative implications about how you have to treat those people. So if there's, if you're an appraiser subjectivist and someone wants to take your money, you don't have to go, well, because you think it's okay to take my money, then it is in fact okay for you to take my money, and I must hand my money over. You could say, no, I'm acting relative to my standards, not yours, and I don't want you to take my money, so you can't have it. So often when people frame relativism, they conflate agent or appraiser relativism, or they're just not aware of the distinction at all. And they frame relativism as though it's only agent relativism. This is a common mischaracterization of relativist positions. And, Harris here seems to be moving from the rejection of realism to the endorsement of agent cultural relativism. And that doesn't follow. So yeah, I agree. Agent cultural relativism is bad. But I think most anti-realists probably would. This isn't an indictment of anti-realism. It's an indictment of a very specific position.
Be to merely foist one provincial notion of human rights on the rest of humanity. Any notion of human rights is the product of culture, and declaring a universal conception of human rights is an intellectually illegitimate thing to do. Okay, this was the best our social sciences could do with the crematoria of Auschwitz still smoking. It has long been obvious that we need to converge as a global civilization in our beliefs about how we should treat one another. For this, we need some universal conception of right and wrong. So in addition to just not being true, I think skepticism about moral truth actually has consequences that really should worry.
Hold up, pause.
Definition.
So I agree on having a universal conception, but universal is not the same thing as there being stance-independent or objective moral truths. I could just say, yeah, I want everybody to follow the same rules, my rules. And you don't have to think they're objectively true.
Exactly. And particularly when you think about something like creating a legal political document that other countries are supposed to sort of sign up to, you're kind of just doing that by fiat and consent of those other countries signing up to it, right? I mean, for example, we have this thing in the UK at the minute where our current government is trying to pull out of the European Convention on Human Rights so we can deport people seeking asylum in our country to Rwanda, which isn't deemed a safe country by European courts. And, in this document, it says that people might legitimately, cross a border illegally if they're seeking asylum fleeing war or something. So we should process them in the same way and not do something like deport them to Rwanda. Anyway, the point is that nothing about metaphysical commitments changes there when our government tries to pass some bill in order to override what a European court says so they can enact some policy on immigration. Instead, everything that happens is completely disconnected from any of this theory stuff. And it's not like whether the legal bill gets passed one way or another changes then if Sam's right about his metaphysics of morality or something. Sam could still be right, but the thing that we care about there is what we can actually do politically and what our institutions enforce and how people live in that first order sense. And so even the appeal to this UN Declaration of Human Rights after World War II, again, that's entirely a question for politics, institutions, geopolitics. What will people actually do? And whether or not you've got Sam's theory has nothing to do with it. If some despot's going to come along and pull out of it and ignore it completely, or if liberal democracies are going to spring up everywhere and sign up to it and try to legalize those things, it's just disconnected from whether or not they believe Sam's meta-ethical theory.
Yeah, his meta-ethical theory is just inert here. The appeals that you would make to people are with respect to their own values, and that's achieved through persuasion, concession, imposition. So you go to one group and you say, listen, we would like you to make these concessions and change your human rights things. And if they're like, no, we don't want to, okay, well, we're going to embargo you, or we'll impose this penalty on you, or whatever. So by some combination of force, appeal to people's humanity, appeal to their own values, persuasion, diplomacy, negotiation. This is how you get people on board with your projects, through the actual practical. I very much doubt that you could go to
I don't know, North Korea and say, listen, moral realism is true. Here's this paper by Mike Schumer. And then they read the paper and then they go, shit, I guess moral
It's the moral landscape.
and Sam Harris's specific normative moral theory is correct. And so now I'm going to like, I don't think the causal direction is quite that way. You could appeal to saying, hey, the way that you're set up your society is not leading to flourishing within your society by your own lights. And then if you could convince them of that somehow, then maybe they would change. But the point would just be that, like, it'd be, again, to draw on the culinary examples, if someone says, look, I think that this food is going to taste bad and I don't want to eat it because I won't like it. If you say, okay, but whether or not you would like the taste of the food, setting aside issues of nutrition and cost and ethics and all that aside, it's objectively tasty, and so you should eat it. That's not no one's gonna care about that. And it seems Sam agrees that moral facts don't have to be motivating. Didn't he? I don't recall exactly.
Well, I wasn't really sure what his point was there, because it seemed like he said that, but then on the thought experiment, it seemed like he said you have to be motivated. So I really don't get what his point was actually there. But
I don't. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Fair enough. I don't know. I'm also running a bit out of steam because we're at about 2.5 hours, but it looks like we're going to be able to finish this video. So part of the issue there is just that you don't need any appeal to moral truth or any type of moral realism to say, yeah, we need a shared set of values and we need some means of like, look, the institutions and laws in a community, they don't require the presumption of realism. You require stability and coherence and a clear set of rules for people to follow, and blah, 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 for practical reasons, not because they conform with the objective moral truths. What if it turned out the objective moral truths were totally misaligned with what we ourselves wanted? Then we would just say, to hell with the moral truths. We'll be immoral, precisely in line with the kind of lives we want to live. Who gives a shit about those rules? So if the moral facts are disconnected from what we ourselves want, why would we comply with them? I think as a matter of descriptive fact, people would then set them aside and ignore them. So to me, it seems like I rarely say this, but some type of anti-realist meta-ethical approach where you construe what it is we like how we go about achieving things descriptively and like what people would be responsive to. An anti-realist approach strikes me as obvious. Like I just don't see any reason why disconnected moral facts that we may or may not care about would be any driving force at all in how we went about doing anything.
And even contrary to the point that Sam was raising there, right? Humanity did in fact managed to create the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights without appealing to Sam's meta-ethical theory or any meta-ethical theory to do it, right? So he was saying when they initially did it, there was a problem because people in the social sciences think that you can't talk about morality or something, and that was his justification that he was offering for why we need this meta-ethical theory. But it seems that actually we did manage to draft up this Declaration of Human Rights without that. So why is this required? It doesn't seem that it is, even in the case he's appealing to.
True. I think skepticism about moral truth actually has consequences that really should worry us. Definitions matter. And in science, we're always in the business of making definitions that serve to constrain the path of any conversation. There's nothing about this process that condemns us to the epistemological relativism or subjectivism that nullifies truth claims. For instance, we define physics as, loosely speaking, our best effort to understand the behavior of matter and energy in the universe. The discipline of physics is defined with respect to the goal of understanding how the physical world behaves. Now, of course, anyone is free to define physics in some other way. A creationist could say, well, that's just not my definition of physics. My physics is designed to match the book of Genesis. But we are free to respond to such a person by saying, you really don't belong at this conference. That's not the physics we're interested in.
I think that Sam... Oh, sorry, you go ahead.
Yeah, so here's the issue. So if Sam wants to make this move and say, look, we get to decide on the content of the goal. So like physics, we're trying to understand matter and energy. If that's not what you want to do, you're not doing physics. Okay, the issue is that most of the rest of us probably don't think of morality in terms of well-being, especially Sam's weird and obscure and underdeveloped construal of it. We think morality is something else. So Sam is the one that the rest of us are excluding from the table. Goodbye, Sam. You're not welcome at the table because you want to insist on your definition, which is idiosyncratic, and the rest of us don't share it. You don't have an argument for it. You just want us to all mutually agree because we got to agree on something. Okay, well, we don't agree on your proposal. So goodbye.
You don't get to sit at the table. Like, why can't we just exclude him by saying he's not talking about what the rest of us want to talk about? Why does he get to monopolize the term morality? Why is his theory a theory of morality? He wants to distance himself from meta-ethics and academic moral philosophy. Fine. Oh, so we have all this terminology over here. Why are you using the same terminology as us if you don't want to be a part of it? It'd be like if I totally reject astrology, but I want to do something else and I want to insist on calling it astrology. I'm the weirdo there. I'm the odd one out. So, if Harris here is the odd one out, why is he analogizing his position to being the mainstream view when he is the one that's not in the mainstream? He's the one holding the fringe position. He is, with respect to morality, the creationist in his analogy. So what the heck is he doing? So then fine, leave the table. Go do schmorality somewhere and have schmoral realism. Good for you.
And I think a thing I find problematic about what Sam's saying here is this idea that we agree upon the definitions of words and then they determine what subjects become or what things are in the world. I just don't think that in the case of the sciences and so forth, that is the way that things happen. People didn't decide on some definition of physics and then, produce the kind of theories that we have. The reason that physics encompasses the set of practices and theories that it does is an incredibly complicated historical story based off of, various different types of experiments and cultural conditions and so forth. And there are definitely times in history where people were proposing aspects of things we would consider to be modern physics, right? Where other people would say, no, that's not what we consider physics to be because it's this. And actually revision in the direction of what we would consider modern physics entailed violating someone else's definition preconceived that they had. So I think that this is just the wrong view to have, that like there's some agreed upon definition and then everything fits it. In the case of physics and the sciences, but also in the case of like most other words, right? It's more complicated, the way that we should construct the way that we should put constraints on the sort of like semantic range of a word, if you will.
Such a gesture of exclusion is legitimate and necessary. The fact that the discourse of physics is not sufficient to silence such a person, the fact that he cannot be brought into our conversation and subdued by its terms, does not undermine physics as a domain of objective truth. And yet on the topic of morality, we seem to think that the possibility of differing opinions puts the very reality of the subject matter in question. The fact that someone can come forward and say that his morality has nothing to do with human flourishing, that it depends upon following Sharia law, for instance, the fact that such a position can be articulated has caused people to think that there's no such thing as moral truth. Morality must be a human invention, because look, that guy has a morality of his own. If the Taliban don't agree with us, who are we to say they're wrong? But this is just a fallacy. We have an intuitive physics, but much of our intuitive physics is wrong with respect to the goal of understanding how matter and energy behave in this universe.
When he said this is just a fallacy, which fallacy in particular? But further, there are some people who perhaps reason that way, but I'm not sure that is the way that the vast majority of people are reasoning. Instead, I think that what's going on is that people recognize that they value something, and then they maybe recognize that they live in some kind of liberal democracy with other people who have different values. And so they think, I've got to, rather than them thinking, therefore, values aren't real or there's no fact of the matter. Instead, they think I should temper, my values and the things I want against the values that other people who exist in the society I live in want as well. I think that that's more akin to what's going on. And then people become less confident or less prescriptive in their own kind of like moral judgments. But I think that Sam's just kind of like telling this story about what's happening in every case for everyone in the world based off of like meta-ethical arguments. And I just don't think that is what's going on at all. Like, I don't think that describes the phenomena of change in values across the US or, people's attitudes towards terrorist organizations or anything like that, as Sam seems to be sort of gesturing towards it.
Yeah, his use of the term fallacy is a bit of a concern for me, because fallacy as a term has specific usages within philosophy, and I don't know if he's intending to invoke what are that usage, and then that would prompt the question, like, okay, well, which fallacy does he have in mind? If he's not using language in that way, then I think he's speaking in a way that's a bit uncareful, because if you're doing philosophy,
you're going to employ terminology that has distinct meanings in the field, it would be a good idea to conform your use of those terms to their typical meaning in the field. So if he's not invoking fallacy in the sense that philosophers use the term, then I think he's speaking a bit carelessly here. As far as so there is I think a pretty straightforward inferential mistake that many people do make, and I think he's correctly identified, which is that many people will say, well, people disagree about moral issues, so there couldn't be an objective moral fact about it. And so they'll move very quickly from the observation of apparent, widespread, significant disagreement. And I do say apparent because some apparent moral disagreements may not be due to a fundamental moral disagreement. They're due to a disagreement over the non-moral facts. So people could disagree about, say, the rightness or wrongness of abortion because they disagree about when a fetus develops sentience and thereby ethical status. And so they have different policy positions on when an abortion is permissible because they have different beliefs about the non-moral facts. And if you were to resolve that disagreement about the non-moral facts, then their moral facts would snap into line and be in agreement with one another. And so a lot of apparent fundamental moral disagreement is actually due to non-moral disagreement. How much? I don't know. That's a difficult empirical question to answer. So I say apparent. Now, you look at all that apparent moral disagreement, and then if you simply say, well, they all disagree, so there couldn't be a truth about the matter, that'd be really silly. Because if you went to a scientific dispute in the, I don't know, 1800s about natural selection, would you say, well, scientists disagree about natural selection, therefore there's literally no objective fact of the matter? Scientists have had disputes about whether there has ever been life on Mars. They don't agree. Does that mean there's no objective fact of the matter? No, that's very silly. So one cannot immediately infer from the presence of widespread and seemingly relevant disagreement about a particular issue that there's no objective fact of the matter. That would be a silly inference. But there are better versions of the argument from disagreement, which, I mean, one, they're not a fallacy in the sense that they're valid arguments and they're not committing any of the sort of standard.
Well, they could be if Sam sort of painted a particular inference that someone was making that was fallacious. The problem is that it's all vague gesturing towards, no real particular arguments that anyone made, and then claiming it's
there's this there's this vague sense that there's people out there that leap too quickly from there's disagreement to moral realism can't be true. And I think it's a good idea to say those people are mistaken, but there's better ways of framing it. You could say something like, many people, not necessarily academic philosophers, but sometimes perhaps, but many people will immediately jump from the fact that there are apparent widespread moral disagreements to the conclusion that therefore moral realism cannot be true. Those people are making a mistake when they do that. That is an inference that simply doesn't follow. They're being too quick about that. And the mere fact that people disagree doesn't entail that there's no fact of the matter, and then give a couple examples like I did. Then I would just say, yep, I agree with that. But the issue is that philosophers like anti-realists do present an argument from disagreement that, one, is valid in a way where it's not clearly subject to any particular accusation of being a fallacy, at least not in the sense that philosophers use the term. And two, there's more going on with those arguments. So one might say something like, look, we can start to have this, like there could be an abductive argument that the best explanation for the persistence of seemingly irresolvable disagreement between epistemic peers that have expertise about a topic could be that there is no objective fact of the matter about that. So, if you have a bunch of experts that have spent a million years looking at the topic, there don't appear to be any available means for them to resolve the disagreement. They still disagree, and they agree on all the seemingly relevant facts. It might be that there's no fact of the matter. That might be your a conclusion you arrive at. Actual arguments for disagreement are going to appeal to those sorts of considerations, like irresolvable epistemic impasses and those sorts of things. They're not just going to point to the brute fact of apparent widespread disagreement among like lay people as like dispositive on the matter. That would be a very crude argument from disagreement. So there's still more that could be said that's not clearly fallacious.
Universe. I'm saying that we also have an intuitive morality, and much of our intuitive morality may be wrong with respect to the goal of maximizing human flourishing and with reference to facts that govern the well-being of conscious creatures generally. I'll now deal with the fundamental challenge to the thesis I put forward in the moral landscape and argue, briefly, that the only sphere of legitimate moral concern is the well-being of conscious creatures. I'll say a few words in defense of this assertion, but I think the idea that it even has to be defended is the product of several fallacies and double standards that we're not noticing, and I'll mention a few. I'm claiming that consciousness is the only context in which we can...
you'll have to pay for the argument.
Is there more to hear? I don't know how much I'll say before it fades out.
Yeah, I don't think so.
Well, what's the alternative?
Can you play it? Just to... Oh no.
If you'd like to continue listening
Yeah.
to this conversation, you'll need to subscribe at samharris.org. Once you do, you'll get access to all full-length episodes of the Making Sense podcast. The podcast is available to everyone through our scholarship program. So if you can't afford to subscribe,
Yeah.
We could request permission to play the rest of the episode and then review it. It'll be like 6 hours,
That's
but-
true. That's true. Actually, that could be an interesting way of maybe getting Sam to engage too. But obviously, if you disagree, you are engaging in several fallacies. So,
Well, what we could do, because I hope we did a pretty decent job there of covering this. We could try to ping Sam and get this on his radar, and perhaps he'll give it a review. So maybe if people in the audience are on Twitter, you could tweet out this video. Is that okay, Nathan?
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Don't worry. Yeah. Absolutely.
Share it around. Oh, well, he's not on Twitter anymore. I don't know. Email it to him. I don't know.
Yeah.
But maybe you shouldn't change the name to something like Sam Harris destroyed with facts and logic. I don't think he'll listen if we do that.
Yeah, I don't know how people kind of get through to him, though. He has appeared recently, like on the Decoding the Gurus podcast and stuff. But I don't know if that's because they've got like a bigger profile, so when they disagree, there's kind of like more in it to bother engaging. But he did talk to that Enya podcast when she was pretty small, so maybe he would do it. I don't know.
That was many years ago. That was like 7 or 8 years ago. So I don't know what his current attitude is about speaking to people.
Yeah.
I don't have a very big channel. I have spoken to him before, like in person. So that was
conference or something.
He gave a talk, I think at Harvard in 2014, I want to say. It might have been for his Waking Up book tour. I feel like that's what it probably was. Like he was on a book tour and he gave a talk there. And yeah, there was some event afterwards and I spoke with him briefly, but he was surrounded by a lot of people that all wanted to talk to him. So I didn't get a chance to talk to him very long.
Fair enough. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, like the video, leave a comment, promote it in the algorithm, share it around, and obviously subscribe to Lance Independent, where Lance talks about all of the topics associated with morality and motivation and psychology and experimental philosophy in much more depth than I do. Just because some people with limited cognitive skills have joined later on in the stream, could you summarize the live stream in one sentence, Lance?
Ooh, let me think about that. I think what I would say is that Sam Harris has released a podcast which seems to be intended to address criticism, concerns, and so on with respect to his views on meta-ethics. However, from what he said, doesn't seem to have updated or modified his view in any substantive way. And he still is making what I take to be the same mistakes as he made previously in his earlier work, dating back to, I think, 2011 when The Moral Landscape came out. He simply does not provide anything by way of a substantive and well-developed account, nor does he provide much in the way of a substantive argument for that account. And so I think we should remain utterly unconvinced of what he is saying, both in this podcast and in his work in meta-ethics more generally.
Nice. Well, on that note, then I will roll credits.